Yes, colleague, you're absolutely right. It's the one who are in time that should be rewarded. So good morning to you all, colleagues. For the second half of the day of this week of our committee, if there no adjustment to the agenda that is adopted, we have two important issues on the agenda. The first report of our two rapporteurs, and then a long hearing with representatives of the Commission with regard to TCMV and TAAEG. First of all, the interim report. As you all know, within our mandate of the 17th of December, it is required that the AMIS Committee of Inquiry to present an interim report. And as you all know, in the coordinators we agreed to do this on a purely technical base. But to introduce, I would gladly like to give the floor to Mr. Zalba.
Gracias, querida.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear Chairman. For about a half a year now, the European Parliament decided that we would inquire into this issue, the allegations of infringement or misadministration of EU law in relation to automobile emissions. As you all know, we need to be focusing our attention on compliance with the regulations that were established under the regulation of the vehicle emissions. That is 715 of 2007, for type approval, of course. And so we need to be verifying whether or not we have evidence for the use of defeat devices, as well as the review of whether or not the member states have implemented the 2007-46 Directive 2007-46. Therefore, we have invented a number of different representatives, experts, industrialists, as well as representatives from the European Commission. In September, I was very pleased to see that we had commissioners and former commissioners to come here. Unfortunately, Commissioner Hogan has decided not to appear before this committee. But I would like to congratulate our chair for having insisted on the possibility of inviting this commissioner. So I would like to thank her for her efforts there, despite the fact that they were for naught. This morning we are presenting our review of the situation, the interim report. And for the time being, we can see that it is still very early in the process. Therefore, it is impossible for us to be able to submit conclusions. Now, of course, I remain available to all of the colleagues to hear your comments and input on the subject, and the co-rapporteurs as well, the shadow rapporteurs, if they would have anything to add on this subject. And I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gerben, you want to come in now or you want to come in at the end? At the end. I first give the floor then to our shadow rapporteurs. Mrs. Revaud d'Allon-Bonnefroid, please.
Merci. Bien évidemment, le groupe des socialistes.
Thank you. Of course, the S&D group supports this report. It's just an interim report. I think it's important to make that clear. And I think it is important to already look at the first hearings that we've had, and they have shown us that it really was a good idea to set up this committee of inquiry. And so at this point, I don't have any specific comments to make. But I think it is important that we're having this interim report, and I'm very much looking forward to working with the two rapporteurs on the final report, and I'm available to them for any assistance I could provide. Thank you, Mr. Henkel.
Ja, ich möchte first of all for this excellent insurance report. Thank you very much. I only have sort of three general observations. One is we continue to mix up too often the problem of the defeat device with the difference of emissions between test and real driving, even in this committee. Number two, I was noticing that some witnesses were invited to obviously spread sort of ideological messages which have nothing to do with the subject of the group. And positive, I should say that there doesn't seem to be any evidence that the diesel technology is unable to fulfill what we would like it to fulfill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henkel. Mr. Ch08. I saw him this morning coming in. Okay. Okay, sorry. Mr. Eickhout.
I think he was outside calling, but...
yeah, maybe he'll come in. Yeah.
Just from...
Jenom z naší perspektivy jenom jedna připomínka. Teď musíme být trošičku kritičtější, co se týče spolupráce a služeb JSC k tomu, jakým způsobem poskytují informace, odpovídají otázky. Je to velice pomalé. My jsme si toho všimli, že tady není jaksi ochota k otevřenosti na straně komise a to musí si uvědomit jako vyšetřovací výbor, musíme se k tomu jasně vyjádřit. Jinak, co se týče závěrů a podobně, tak to bude v závěrečné zprávě. Je to dobré, děláme pokrok, já doufám, že v druhé polovině budeme rychlejší a že komise si uvědomí, že když něco budou skrývat, tak to bude pouze jejich neprospěch. Děkuji, pan Ch08.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I have to say that our group considers and has considered from the very
Mluváme se technické problémy.
From the very beginning that we should use this interim report to make an initial evaluation. We have enough evidence from the written deposition.
Předběžné
We believe
για αυτό το σκάνδαλο.
And we need to find those responsible for this scandal. And I understand that the majority of the political groups said that this report should remain a technical one, a factual one. But there are still some political observations in the interim report. It is mentioned that we have not yet found evidence or etc. So if that is the case, if we want to remain on a technical level, we should not make this evaluation, and we should therefore reformulate paragraph G and only present the invitations that we extended to witnesses, etc. So we would like to see a change in paragraph G.
Thank you very much. I leave the floor to Mr. Gerbrandy, who will address the issues also on paragraph G, I think. Mr. Gerbrandy.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and let me start by thanking my fellow rapporteur, Pablo Zalba, the Secretariat of the committee, but also the coordinators for the smooth cooperation in not only drafting but also coming to this interim report, which, as Pablo Zalba already mentioned, is just a procedural one. And to go into point G, I do believe that this is also procedural. This is an inquiry committee where we have to draw conclusions at the end. And I think it is very premature after a few hearings to come already to certain midterm conclusions. But having said that, I must also take this opportunity to come forward with some criticism, and that criticism is primarily focusing on the Commission, on the European Commission. If you read the explanatory statement, and you see that we already in April, the 7th of April and the 14th of April, the coordinators approved requests for many documents, and we haven't received them yet. The 7th of April is already 6 weeks ago. No, more than 2 months ago. So that is a very long time. And if you realize yourself that this committee is only set for 1 year, 12 months, then more than 2 months is a lot of time to wait for documents. I must say, in my national parliament in the Netherlands, an inquiry committee does not start with the hearings before they have studied all the documents that they have asked for. We, due to our internal regulations, we were sort of forced to start with our hearings before we have received any documents from the Commission, besides the already public documents that were put on a large list at the beginning. I find that unacceptable, and I do believe that the Commission should really, really step up its efforts to cooperate. If we ask for documents, I don't expect them in 24 hours, but 48 hours is not a very, very strange amount of time to ask for documents. So I would really like to urge the European Commission to be more cooperative. To give you just one more example, a thing that I've experienced last week in the Netherlands, there was an initiative from the Parliament's Bureau in The Hague in the Netherlands to organize a press briefing in the Netherlands, and they are doing so on a regular basis. Every few weeks there are MEPs and someone from the Commission, someone from Parliament, giving a sort of neutral press briefing to Dutch journalists. And that's always a joint effort from the Parliament's Bureau in The Hague and the Commission's Bureau in The Hague. This time the Commission declined its cooperation. I find that a very strange decision, and I'm not saying that it's political, but it smells a bit like it. So I would really like to take this opportunity to once again urge the European Commission to cooperate more strongly and to send the documents that we have asked for to Parliament. And the same for the documents that have to be read by us in a secured reading room. That is all I think I would like to say now. Once again, many thanks for the smooth cooperation within this committee, and I hope that we can vote soon on this interim report and that we can move on to the real work in the coming months. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much to our two rapporteurs, the shadow rapporteurs and the coordinators for the good cooperation up until now. I have all the confidence for the future. And with regard to the remarks on the documents, I think we will discuss that issue further on in the coordinators' meetings. But it's good that the message is passed to the Commission that we will put up the pressure, and it's important that they know, in general, that they know that there is a growing frustration in the committee with regard to the cooperation, and I think we need to handle and tackle that, but we're on to that. The deadline of amendments for this report, of which we hope there's only one amendment, is set on the 20th June, which is tomorrow at 18 hours. The adoption of the report in our committee is scheduled for the 13th of July at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the plenary debate and adoption in plenary is set for September this year. If there are no remarks, we can pass on to our hearing. We have a special hearing, and we have 4 representatives of the Commission, of whom 2 are retired, if I'm well informed. 1 is retired, if I'm well informed.
One.
I'll gladly introduce them to you and then give some introductory remarks. Next to me is Mr. Gwenol Gozigo, who is the Director of Industrial Policy and Economic Analysis from June 2015. Mrs. Joanna Sikowska, who is Head of the Automotive Unit, also from June 2015. Mr. Philippe Jean, who is the former head of the automotive industry from January 2008 up until May 2015. And Mr. Reinhard Schulke-Braux, if I pronounce that good, who is the former head of the automotive industry until December 2007. I stress a little bit the dates because it's important for the members if they raise questions related to certain periods. It's important that you know who's responsible for what. This is a hearing of maximum. We don't have to take all the time, but of maximum 3 hours because we have 4 representatives. Mr. Cozigo, who is the actual head today, Director of the Industrial Transformation and Advanced Value Chain in the DG GROW, will explain how the TCMV operates under the comitology rules, its tasks and its composition. The TCMV is a regulatory committee which provides a binding opinion on the Commission's draft implementation measures. You will also explain how the process of introduction in the real driving emissions, the RDE test procedure, was dealt with within the TCMV, and you will elaborate on the role of the Commission and the Member States in the Type Approval Authority Expert Group, TAAEG, and you will point out the relevant differences with respect to TCMV, amongst many other issues. You have 20 minutes for your introduction. As I said before, we have 3 full hours, not necessary to take every space, but we do have a lot of space to ask a lot of questions. And as always, we start with the rapporteurs, the representatives of the different political groups, and then a bigger time slot for the 3-minute question and answers. I would like to remind colleagues that, if possible, raise your question towards one of the 4 representatives. Now, Mr. Guigou, I gladly gladly give you the floor for a maximum of 20 minutes for your introductions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, these Vice Chairs and members, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting the 4 of us to this hearing. Today, as requested, I'll speak in my introduction about the 2 consultative bodies whose activities relate to the implementation of the European legislation on type approval of motor vehicles. They operate in a different setup and with different objectives. First, I will clarify the tasks, composition and way of work of the TCMV, the Technical Committee for Motor Vehicles. Then I'll continue by explaining how the process of introduction of the RDE test procedure was dealt with by TCMV. And, as you mentioned, Madam Chair, I'll elaborate on the role of the Commission and Member States in the Type Approval Authorities Expert Group, TAEG, and will point to the relevant differences between TCMV and TAEG in terms of objectives and functioning. So, let me start with the TCMV. The TCMV operates under a so-called comitology set of rules. The treaty determines that primary responsibility for implementing EU law lies with EU member states. However, where uniform conditions of implementation of the legislation are needed, an EU legal act may confer implementing powers on the Commission. And the Commission, in order to execute these powers, and powers that are conferred to it by the co-legislators, must develop the implementing measures in consultation with the committee where all member states are represented. As a general rule, experts representing member states in the committees are authorized by their administration, in accordance with their national rules, to express the position of their country on each agenda point of the meeting. The internal coordination of positions between the different bodies concerned in the member states is done at national level. In other words, this is a process by which member states control the secondary legislative process of the Commission when drafting acts that implement the EU laws. There are several procedures possible. The choice of procedure is made by the co-legislators, the European Parliament and the Council, in each co-decision act concerned, taking into account the nature of implementing powers that are laid out there. Depending on the particular procedure specified in the co-decision acts being implemented, these opinions are binding for the Commission to different degrees. The vehicle emissions legislation was adopted in 2007, and thus the applicable comitology procedure is the regulatory procedure with scrutiny. While the Treaty of Lisbon introduced modifications regarding comitology, including the distinction between implementing and delegated acts, which entered into force on the 1st of January 2009, these do not apply fully to the type approval legislation yet. A co-decision proposal aiming to Lisbonize the legislation is actually currently with the co-legislators, is being now examined. The TCMV is thus set up as a regulatory committee in the comitology context. As such, it consists of representatives from all member states and is chaired by the Commission. The TCMV provides an opinion on implementing measures drafted by the Commission, and it does that on the basis of a qualified majority vote. For the regulatory procedure with scrutiny which applies in this case, the positive opinion of the committee is necessary for the Commission to adopt the draft implementing measure. These implementing measures are also subject to the scrutiny of the European Parliament and the Council. Having said that, now let me focus on the RDE package and how it was dealt with by the TCMV. The development of robust procedures for testing the emissions of vehicles in real driving emissions was based on the outcome of the studies mandated by the Commission to the Joint Research Centre. The initial technical work was entrusted to the RDLDV, the Real Driving Emissions of Light-Duty Vehicles Working Group, and its subgroups set up by the Commission to provide its services with technical expertise and advice. The objective was to have the new RDE test procedure in place in September 2017, as announced by the Commission in 2012 in the CARS 2020 communication. On the 1st of April 2014, the Commission presented to the Member States in TCMV its vision for the architecture of the RDE package. This was mandated by the Euro 5, Euro 6 legislation in force, Regulation 715 of 2007. The Commission presented a roadmap proposing to split the RDE legislation in 4 separate regulatory acts, as the progress on all the elements could not advance at the same pace. The roadmap proposed by the Commission was feasible from a technical and administrative point of view and was endorsed by Member States in TCMV. However, because each of the regulatory drafts had to be accepted by a qualified majority of Member States, there was always a risk of possible delays. RDE discussions were subsequently included in the agenda of each TCMV meeting in the period from April 2014 to May 2015, about 10 meetings. Given that the development of the test procedure for the monitoring of NOx emissions under real driving emissions was considered the most urgent, it was included in the draft for the first RDE Act, the first of the 4 foreseen. The draft regulation was sensitive since it had to consider, on one hand, the legally correct implementation of emission limits under normal conditions of use specified by Euro 5, Euro 6 regulation, and the serious air quality concerns related to high nitrogen dioxide, NO2, concentrations. And on the other hand, it had also to consider the competitiveness impact for vehicle manufacturers. By the end of 2014, the TCMV expressed general support for the RDE test procedure. That is, the actual substance of the draft of the first draft RDE regulation. However, a number of elements were still questioned by Member States and had to be partially redefined. The discussions after November 2014 focused on the indication in recitals of future intentions of the Commission for the second RDE Act. The main issues were the definition of the complementary dynamic boundary conditions and the regulatory not to exceed emission limits applicable in RDE testing. The not to exceed emission limits are obtained by multiplying the regulatory emission limit with the conformity factors. These issues had no direct impact on the first RDE Act. After the Commission completed its inter-service consultations, the draft regulation was included in the agenda of the meeting on 24th of March 2015 for the TCMV to deliver its opinion. However, at the meeting, an initial round of informal assessment by the Member States showed that there was insufficient support for the Commission draft. There was actually no qualified majority foreseeable. Very shortly before the TCMV meeting, Germany had submitted a compromise proposal which did not contain target dates for introducing conformity factors and suggested introducing them in 2 steps via a recital. Due to the short notice of the submission, it could not be formally accepted at that meeting as Member States didn't have their final positions. For this reason, the TCMV opinion on the draft of the first RD Act was voted at the following meeting on the 19th of May 2015 by the majority of Member States present. Immediately after the first regulatory RD Act had been adopted, the Commission proceeded with the draft for the second regulatory act. It was approved by TCMV on the 28th of October 2015. The draft regulation was developed on the basis of an analysis of the uncertainties of the portable emission measurement system, the PEMS procedure, and equipment, as well as of existing PEMS data. The second RD Act sets out the quantitative targets for NOx emissions of diesel vehicles during the RDE test. This is done by determining the conformity factors. To be more precise, these conformity factors define the absolute maximum level of emissions in all different conditions of the test cycle, including, for example, when climbing a steep hill. So they are naturally higher than the limits set out in the Euro 5, Euro 6 regulation, which defines the average emissions that shall be emitted. The second regulatory RD Act further introduces an obligation for the car manufacturers to declare their emissions reduction strategy. The Commission's initial draft was very ambitious as it proposed conformity factors at the lower end of the identified ranges for conformity factors, which was justified from a legal and technical perspective according to the Commission's analysis. This draft regulation had to be modified towards higher conformity factors, though still within the limits of the identified ranges, in order to obtain a qualified majority among Member States. The finally voted conformity factors thus remain within the initial ranges identified by the Commission on the basis of the technical analysis. Currently, the Commission continues to work intensively on the third and the fourth RD Acts. The third RD Act will be presented still this year, while the fourth RD Act is expected in early 2017. The third RD Act will define a procedure for the measurement of particulates and include the effect of the vehicle cold start into the RDE testing. And in addition, the Commission will oblige manufacturers to publish the conformity factor of an individual vehicle in its certificate of conformity. That way, consumers will have full transparency on the real emission performance. In the fourth RDE Act, the Commission will define the rules for independent RDE testing of vehicles being in service, including the regulatory consequences in case of non-conformity. To conclude on the RDE process, I would like to recall a few elements. First, the new RDE test procedure was developed on the basis of studies that were carried out by the Joint Research Centre and the preparatory work of technical experts in the real driving emissions of light-duty vehicles expert working group, the RDE-LDV. Second, issues raised in the discussions at TCMV are carefully assessed by the Commission services in the light of the available scientific and technical data and are referred for technical discussions to the level of the RDE-LDV working group when needed. Third, consensus building and the ability to reach compromises are crucial for a timely adoption of draft implementing measures by the Commission, since in the committee, Member States have the power to block.
Colleagues.
Third, consensus building and the ability to reach compromises are crucial for the timely adoption of draft implementing measures by the Commission, since in the committee, Member States have the power to block the process. A qualified majority, I recall, is support of a proposal is needed. Fourth, although there was a slight delay in the adoption of the first RD Act by the Commission due to the delay in the TCMV vote, this has not affected the timeline foreseen since the beginning for the implementation of the procedure. The Commission has always put a lot of importance on the timely progress of the file and treated the RDE decision as a matter of acute priority. The RDE test procedure already started to apply for monitoring purposes in the beginning of this year and will apply together with the conformity factors from September 2017. To finalize, I'll say a few words about the Type Approval Authorities Expert Group, TAEG. The TAEG is an expert group composed of national type approval authorities, which operates in an informal setting and thus can't take any binding decision, in contrast to the TCMV. It was created in 2010 to ensure transparency in the necessary exchanges between the Commission and the national type approval authorities. The TAEG is chaired by the Commission and provides a platform for exchange of views and coordination among the national type approval authorities in order to ensure the uniform application of type approval legislation across the Union. Hence, TAEG's purpose lies not in decision-taking at all, but rather in an exchange of information and interpretation of the rules. Meeting minutes are available on the Commission website. Questions for discussions in TAEG are raised by the Commission or by the Member States, usually after having been discussed in the Type Approval Authorities meeting, where the Commission does not participate. In regard to TAEG's work related to emissions, I'd like to point out two things. First, the gap between laboratory test results and real-life results on vehicle emissions has not been discussed in TAEG, as this has been addressed through the TCMV. The introduction of a more representative test cycle, WLTP, and of real driving emissions, RDE, testing, are implementing measures which need to be passed through the comitology procedure. Second, the use of defeat devices has not been discussed in TAEG before the Volkswagen revelations either. Indeed, there were no instances of any type approval authority requesting clarifications from the Commission on the EU provisions in this respect or sharing any information with the Commission or any evidence on the use of defeat devices as banned by EU law. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cosico. We now move to the questions of our committee. We'll start with our rapporteurs, Mr. Zalba.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much for these explanations. Yesterday, a British newspaper emphasized the fact that in 2010, the European Commission was aware of the fact that some manufacturers were using these types of devices. Moreover, the research center that came here for a hearing said that a test vehicle had NOx emissions that were extremely high in type 6 at low temperatures. These NOx emissions at high temperatures are not regulated, So therefore, there was a combustion strategy that was very odd, that was being applied at low temperatures. Moreover, according to the article that was published yesterday in the British newspaper in November 2014, the DG, an individual wrote a letter to Mr. Callejespo stating that DG Enterprise should be looking into the fact that some of these manufacturers were using techniques in order to lower the emissions at low temperatures when the engine requires additional energy. Apparently, the Commission had the responsibility to alert the member states about these types of devices and their uses. I should like to have your reaction to this information and to see if you could confirm that the Commission had any awareness of the use of these types of devices, these defeat devices, on behalf of the automobile manufacturers. Thank you very much.
The concept of defeat devices is not new. They are actually banned by the legislation since 1998, well before the GRC studies were carried out. So member states have a standing obligation to enforce this ban, and the risk of defeat devices was the risk of defeat devices, I insist, was hence known to the Commission and member states, but I have to insist the Commission was not aware of any actual instances of fraud. What we were aware of is that laboratory tests do not accurately capture the amount of emissions that actually are emitted during real driving emissions or during real driving conditions, which can be due to different factors. So we drew the conclusion at that time that we had to improve the test methods, to improve and to develop a new test procedures that was actually allow us to measure the emissions in real driving, and that's why the work on RDE started. The Commission's in-house research centre, the GRC, carried out studies at our request, which were published in 2011-2013 on the Internet and were therefore publicly available. And their content was discussed extensively with Member States who were and remained involved in the development of the new RDE test. The research team measured exhaust emissions. They indeed found that laboratory tests do not accurately capture the amount of NOx emitted in real driving conditions. And they provided a very important support to the Commission's efforts to introduce the RDE. This gap in the emissions testing is public knowledge, but identifying the potential of defeat devices as such has never been part of the studies and wouldn't have been possible since they did not have access to the engine control unit. Only the exhaust emissions were measured. The reports were acted upon. The Commission followed the scientific evidence and immediately started to work on a new real driving emission test procedure in order to have a more accurate way to measure NOx emissions and to minimize the risk of the use of defeat devices. But for our part, knowing that the regulatory framework needed to be improved, the Commission has acted to reform the way tests are conducted. That's what we did. Joanna, do you want to complete on the article?
Yes,
on the article?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. So, regarding the comment you made on the article that was published yesterday in The Guardian, and the alleged exceedance or presence of the defeat device, I would like to clarify that the vehicle that was mentioned was actually a petrol vehicle, so it was not a diesel vehicle. Secondly, it was just one vehicle, and the question arises whether it's proper to this specific car or there is a pattern behind. So this is something that has to be taken into consideration. Also, there was a question of tests that were made, because the reference is made to test 6, which is a cold start test in low temperatures. And these NOx emissions at cold start are not regulated. So this is another element that has to be taken into account. Also, we checked that this vehicle actually performed very well after the initial start. And last but not least, actually rules on defeat devices foresee this cold start as one of the exceptions. So we believe that the example quoted is actually very neutral and doesn't prove anything. Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps a last comment on the article. It mentions leaked documents. Actually, those documents are available on the website of the Commission.
Mr. Gerbrandi.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. We're starting a hearing on this while we have not received the minutes yet of the meetings that we asked for. So this is a very unfortunate situation. So my first question is that you shared a list of participating organizations in the RDE-LDV working group with us, but we haven't received a list of individuals. How many people for one organization, for instance? Could you provide that list today? Because I think that is very, very helpful for us. And could you maybe clarify how many people were there, for instance, from industry at a regular working group meeting? 5 or 20 or 50? And how did that relate to the amount of people from the Commission and the Member States? Since I've seen that only 4 Member States, UK, Sweden, Netherlands and Germany, were represented. Can you say anything about that balance? And briefly, please.
So briefly. Indeed, the representation is balanced in terms not only of who can participate, but also in terms of numbers. On the comment you made regarding the number of member states, actually member states also participate, and this is the proper forum in the work of TCMV. So this is additional possibility for them to participate in the discussion, and some member states are more interested, some are less interested. Regarding the number of participants, of course, associations send the representatives taking into account their capacity, but there has never been a case where there would be 10 or 20 participants from one representing one stakeholder while the others would be underrepresented.
Okay, thank you. But could you still send us that information? Not only the organization represented, but the amount of people that were present. My second question, in question number 4, you stated that you had to wait until 2011 with the launch of the RDE-LDV working group because there were not enough Euro 5 cars on the market. However, on the Euro 3 and 4 discrepancies between test and road were already apparent. Why did you have to wait for Euro 5 cars?
Deux éléments. C'est vrai, il y avait...
Two things. Well, it is true that there was information about the differences between the laboratories noted in laboratories and real vehicles for Euro 4 vehicles, markets of vehicles that were already on the market. But the standards for Euro 5 and 6, I think it was Article 14, said that the performance of vehicles for the Euro 5 and Euro 6 had to be improved before we started with a new test method for real conditions. The first vehicles that appeared on the market, I would recall that the legal obligation was for new types just from 2011. The new vehicles were only available at the end of 2010, start of 2011, so it was important that these vehicles became available before they could be tested under real driving conditions and in line with the Euro 5 and Euro 5C. And that's what was done. The work was started at the end of the year once it was possible to analyze the data, particularly the data from the seminar, which was mentioned a number of times in the discussions that you had with the JRC.
For instance, a hearing we had yesterday, it was common knowledge among experts that the test cycle was completely outdated long before 2011. So why did it take so long, and why didn't you take the steps before to improve that test cycle?
There's no ambiguity about the fact that everyone recognized, and it is true for the Commission service as well, that there was a major difference between the values from the laboratory tests and the real emissions. And so that was the main objective, which was to define a credible and innovative procedure which would make it possible to measure in a realistic way the real emissions. That was the objective. Now, you are right. The data was available already in 2008, but then it was for vehicles which were approved under Euro 4 and were in line with those standards. And the regulation for Euro 5 and Euro 6 said that we had to measure the emissions of the new vehicles. So that would be vehicles complying with the Euro 5 and particularly Euro 6 regulation for diesel vehicles. And so there was an awareness of the problem, but it was important to wait to have the data in order to be able to do the analysis. And this is what was done between 2011 and 2014. And this made it possible to come up with the strategy and the so-called RDE regulation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're talking in circles now, so just like this room. And now I do understand why this working group needed so much time. Thank you.
Mr. Karins.
Yes, thank you very much. It is rather peculiar. So maybe someone could tell me with a short answer, when did the Commission become aware that nitrogen dioxide, the NOx emissions, were a problem with the diesel engines? A date would be fine. Year. I'd be happy with a year.
You mean NOx emissions were a problem, or the measurement of NOx emissions was not accurate?
Lorsque la réglementation
when the Euro 5, Euro 6 regulation was adopted in 2007, that information was already being shared by the co-legislators, and that is why this specific mandate was given to review or revise the directive. So the information was available in 2007 on the basis.
Already in 2007, the Commission knew that NO2 emissions were a problem coming from diesel engines, correct?
Tout à fait.
Right.
Yes.
What then, what was your understanding of the cause of this problem? Why did this problem exist? Well, I mean, if there's a problem, there must be a reason for the problem.
It's a matter of technology that is allowing it to
They're completely incompetent to say.
Si j'ai bien compris votre question.
If I understood your question correctly, you're asking what the reasons were. These were technical reasons. It was due to the technology that was being used. That was the first type of problem. The second type of problem was the difficulty in measuring the impact of emissions when the vehicles received type approval.
Interrupt you, if I may. So you're really not able to say that you understood or didn't understand where the problem came from. Is this correct? I mean, if someone could, what I'm looking for is a non-scripted answer. Just, I really want to understand what's going on.
Yeah, if I may, diesel engines emit more NOx than petrol engines, and
so diesel engines
in the United
emit more.
States, we have always had more diesel engines in Europe than in the US.
Sorry,
our rules were more lenient.
Why do we have more diesel engines in Europe than in the US?
I was going to explain that, if I may, for a few seconds. We've had diesel engines because they emit less CO2. And our ambition was to reduce CO2. So abolishing diesel engines was not an option. Whereas in the US, you did not have passenger cars with diesel engines.
Okay.
And therefore higher CO2 emissions.
Thank you very much. So you have stated clearly that we have problems with the NOx emissions because in Europe we have diesel engines, and the reason we have diesel engines is because our goal has been to reduce CO2. So now, in our goal to reduce CO2, within the Commission, how strong was the awareness that there is this trade-off, that if we reduce CO2, the NOx emissions remain high because the diesels have the NOx emissions?
You may, if you look at the figures of the limit values that have been adopted in Euro 5 and 6, you will see that we have made a determined effort to reduce NOx emissions, and that we came close, but not quite to the same level that was prevalent in the United States. So there was a desire to reduce NOx emissions, and we did work on it and act on it.
If I could, I mean, I'm reading, maybe many of us are reading now a summary of the workshop on the approach on emissions legislations held in Brussels the 23rd of November 2010. It's quite a few years ago. What's interesting here is that it writes that for diesel cars, the NOx emissions are at best stable for the past 25 years and have not decreased even with the latest Euro 4 and 5 diesel cars. Since the relative share of NOx emissions has increased for vehicles equipped with DPFs, I don't remember what they are, the absolute NO2 emissions even appear to have increased over time. So in 2010, you have an internal document that says that for petrol engines, it's going down. For diesel engines, it's actually going up. What was done about that? I mean, we adopt legislation that says it should be lower, but what was actually done that it would be lower?
Vous avez raison.
You're right. There was an awareness of that in 2010, but in 2007, the source of the problem really is the difference between the emissions detected in laboratories and emissions in a real driving cycle. And the objective of the work done in 2010 was to be able to replace the laboratory measurements which hadn't led to a reduction of emissions, which is something that we detected in 2010. And that was the objective of the work. It was to replace the lab testing, which was unsatisfactory because it wasn't possible to get a real reduction in emissions independently of what had been done in the lab testing for Euro 3, Euro 4, with a new method which would make it possible to combine the limits and have a real impact on emissions.
Mrs. Bonifay.
Merci.
Thank you. The European Environment Agency that we heard before you said that in 2004 onwards it has published on its website information about NOx diesel emissions from that date of 2004. I imagine that you will have had knowledge, therefore, in the Commission of that since 2004. I'm therefore, like my colleagues, somewhat taken aback. And certainly there's a political side that I would identify in this, at your failure to reach an agreement with the Member States to progress on RDE. Now, you've also had access to the information, so you'll be aware of the 10,000 per year premature deaths from diesel NOx emissions, which is not insignificant. I'd like to explore in greater depth with you this point. There are inconsistencies in your answers to the questions on questions 5 and 6 on TCMV, on the defeat devices. In one question you say you weren't aware, and on the other one you said that there was a suspicion linked to the defeat devices. Could you be very clear-cut on your knowledge about defeat devices? On your last point on defeat devices, The risk of using defeat devices has been well known for some time. There was a prohibition from 1998 in legislation forbidding the use of defeat devices. The risk, well, the use of defeat devices wasn't brought to our attention. I think I can speak on behalf of my colleagues in saying that we learnt in late September about the use of defeat devices when the Volkswagen affair blew up. The risk wasn't therefore known, was known, and that's why the legislation banned the use of the devices, and it set out conditions whereby those defeat devices may be used. The speaker's cut off. If you look at the 2013 Commission impact study supporting the revision of the directive on page 31, it says clearly
of illegal practices by some end users that defeat the anti-pollution system to improve driving performance or save on the replacement of costly components.
2013, not 2015, therefore. Just to supplement the information my colleague gave you, there was a constant concern with respect to defeat devices, and that concern went back through all the work on RDE, an ongoing concern, therefore, and we wanted to look into these difficult to detect forbidden devices to find a method which would measure emissions whilst avoiding the use of defeat devices. Throughout the work over the years on RDE, you'll find references made to the potential risk posed. We're not talking about potential risks, comes into the interjection. In your impact study, it is talking about proven knowledge. It's not the same thing. It's not a concern. There are deaths and there is proven knowledge. So why? Throughout the years, Commission answer, we were aware of the risk, and this was mentioned in 2010 in the work which enabled us to start our RDE analysis up. You'll also find mention of defeat devices in exchanges of correspondence and information as part of the 2010 seminar and in the report by the Joint Research Centre in 2013. I would say there was awareness around the potential use of defeat devices, but no tangible proof such as would be needed to describe the use of defeat devices. Another question. Were you aware of Mr. Staniga and ACR meeting to discuss the RDE package, and what contact was there between ACR and other industry representatives working with Commission representatives working on this field? Well, I'm going to answer on the second part, contacts with industry. Of course there are contacts with industry. We have contacts with environmental NGOs as well, and member states. We also have contacts with all stakeholders. And this is also to ensure we have a full picture of information. We don't have the revealed truth as members of the Commission staff. So we wanted to have further information to complete our picture, but that doesn't skew our independent evaluation or proposals to our authorities independently for decisions or proposed legislation to be put then to the member states or the co-legislators. Being in touch with everyone is perfectly par for the course. We need information from the field and we need information from experts. And we learn from all sources, be that academic sources or national administrations or environmental NGOs, consumers or industry. With regard to the individual case that you've mentioned, would my colleague like to come in on that?
Very briefly, the meeting that you mentioned at the indicated date that was made public, this meeting didn't take place.
Sorry, Mr. Tozanovsky. Yes.
I'm sorry. Děkuji, paní předsedkyně.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is focused on the future rather than the past. It concerns the testing, real driving tests, which are to be applied starting in 2017, so very soon. It is not clear to me how the measuring will be applied in terms of driving dynamics. The implementing regulation agreed by the relevant committee of the member states refers to accidental slowing down and acceleration, but it really depends on the kind of individual driving, which differs from driver to driver, and there is a lot of leeway. So it is very difficult to compare these figures. So can you explain to me this approach? Thank you.
Yeah, the RD test driving that's actually also part of the element that took a while to develop the RD testing procedure. It's because it's actually in driving conditions, which is much more complex potentially than to look at something on already predefined procedure in a lab, in the laboratory. There are basically two elements where you can have divergence. There's the first thing that we define as boundary conditions, whether altitude, temperature, for example, in which the test takes place. And there is also the way of driving. But on the altitude and environment, etc., if you want the geographical conditions, basically, we have foreseen this margin, which is introduced in the conformity factors, which takes also consideration of the margin of error and the statistical uncertainties we've got now, and that's dealt with. As far as the way of driving is concerned, this is something that we've been asked to consider, but I would like to underline one thing. We will have to consider it, but it will have to be neutral as far as the environmental impact is concerned. Joanna, do you want to complete this?
Maybe indeed a word of additional comment. We had added in the second RD package what we call complementary boundary conditions, and this is exactly the parameter that will allow us to cater for too soft or too aggressive driving. You refer to driving styles, and this is exactly a function that would help to find the right balance between those who like to drive too smoothly and therefore arrive at a certain result, and the same goes for those who like to drive too aggressively.
Mrs. Meisner.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you. You just said that since 2010 you've known of the existence of these defeat devices, and you said that you considered it with concern. Well, that's nice. You're the guardian of the treaties in the Commission. You have said yourselves it's forbidden to use them and that there was no tangible proof that the devices were being used. The question is whether the Commission in those circumstances shouldn't have taken a tougher line and not just being concerned but brought in infringement procedures to cause them to cease and desist. I'm asking you this because PEMs have been well known since 2011 when work has been going on there. I think we're all concerned that there is the feeling that things took a long time. PEMs was an opportunity to look at emissions right from the outset without fraudulent defeat devices being used against them. And now, were there delays for technical reasons, or were member states putting the brake on, delaying things because it took so long? Mr. Gerbrandy has asked about this. Sweden's been using PEMs since 2012, and this year in 2016. There's still work going on in the working group. Meetings are going on looking at how this can be brought about Europe-wide. It's hard for us to see this. Firstly, that people knew that there were defeat devices and apparently nothing or too little was done. And on the other hand, the fact that the PEMs, although they'd been used for so long, as emissions analytics told us yesterday, were still not being used in a Europe-wide form.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Well, maybe first a comment on possible infringement procedure, because you asked whether that wouldn't be an option. I think it's very important to understand that, of course, this is one of the tools that the Commission disposes of. But in order to launch an infringement procedure, it has to be addressed to a concrete member state. So we are not launching in case there is a problem regarding defeat device. We wouldn't be launching an infringement procedure against a manufacturer. This is not in our remit. So that's something that needs to be very clearly understood. So if we are to launch a procedure against the member state, we cannot just send a letter of formal notice because it seems to us that there might be a problem. We have to have a very concrete proof and demonstration and suspicion that rules have been breached, the rules that member states is obliged to enforce, because this is the logic of infringement. And our understanding of the findings of the reports were not at that level that we could have launched an infringement procedure. That doesn't mean that we stayed idle and we didn't do anything. On the contrary, I think colleagues explained what has been done in order to address the problem of NOx exceedance in a horizontal manner. But once again, the fact that defeat device as a phenomenon exists, it hasn't been a new discovery. It is part of vehicle life, if you want, or it's a possibility, and this is regulated by law. But any report that has been brought to our attention didn't indicate that there is a concrete case, concrete member state that could be held responsible for that. If I can just maybe refer to what you mentioned about PEMs. Indeed, PEMs have been in place for a long time, but there is one comment also that needs to be made. PEMs have been used mostly and for a long time with regard to heavy-duty vehicles. And they have been used systematically. They kept on being used. Now, indeed, we are working now to improve the procedure for PEMs for heavy duties. But there is a fundamental difference between PEMs equipment for heavy duties, where there is much more space to install, and I think PEMs for heavy duties is about 100 kilograms weight, and a small passenger car. So, indeed, they have been used for heavy duties, and now we are phasing them in for passenger cars.
Kann ich noch eine kurze Nachfrage stellen? Und zwar
a brief follow-up question, not about PEMs, but on defeat devices again. You said that you didn't have any concrete suspicions, but people knew that there were illegal defeat devices. Well, certainly there was a rumour from somewhere. There must have been some clue as to who knew what. And then, in another question, building on that, was it difficult for you to put in motion infringement procedures because there was no criminal offence in law, if you like? It's difficult for us to understand. You knew that there were defeat devices. They were not reconcilable with the law. You didn't know exactly where they were, but you must have heard of their existence, and you didn't follow it up. Was that simply impossible?
L'existence de defeat devices était connue.
The existence of defeat devices was known, but not their usage. It's clearly the responsibility of the member states to implement EU legislation and to ensure the market is properly surveyed or overseen. What my colleague was explaining was that in the lack of concrete proof, no infringements can be started by the Commission against a member state. We need evidence. We didn't have any such evidence. The responsibility for proper implementation of EU legislation and market surveillance is the member states. We weren't aware of the use of illegal utilisation of defeat devices in automotive legislation, which explains why there was no such infringement proceedings. Mr. Skiliotis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to return to the issue of the responsibility of the member states. In 2013, you had a report by the Joint Research Centre that warned you that such defeat devices could change the results of measurement. And I still do not understand what were the concrete measures that the Commission took. Didn't you ask for follow-up tests, for example, for follow-up measurements? Did you ask the car manufacturers to perform follow-up measurements? That's my first question. And the second one was, when exactly did you inform the member states that there was a problem? We heard about a workshop, but we would like to know exactly when you informed the member states about the existence of this problem. Furthermore, we know that many other car manufacturers besides Volkswagen may be using such software and such defeat devices. In the Clean Transportation Council document that was recently published, we have seen that there is a suspicion that such devices are being used by car manufacturers in France as well. So we could reasonably assume that it's not only Volkswagen that's been using such defeat devices and software, there are other car manufacturers as well. And my question is, does the Commission have information or evidence indicating that other car manufacturers and cars may be using such software and defeat devices?
Je vais répondre à la deuxième partie de votre question.
I'll take you up from the second part of your question about the other manufacturers.
À l'heure actuelle,
as things stand, 2 member states have finalised reports following on from their investigations, that is the UK and Germany. 1 member state has published an interim report and their investigations are still going on, and that's France. There are several member states which have announced that they will be conducting investigations which are still underway, and the Commission hasn't received a report from them. The available reports, the final and interim reports, that is German, UK and French respectively, do not show illegal use of defeat devices by other manufacturers. So there's no major deviation between officially measured and real emissions. That being the case, the Commission hasn't yet set out its position on the reports. On several occasions, in a letter last month and in the Transport Council on the 7th of June, Commissioner Bieńkowska asked Member States to supply the Commission with all the technical information and data they had underlying this analysis in the reports. Because without the detailed data, we're unable to say what we think about the analysis and conclusions of the Member States in those reports. As things stand, the reports available to us from the Member States conducting their investigations do not point to illegal usage of defeat devices, but the Commission is not in a position to give its position. We've asked Member States to supply us with more detailed data, and we're also waiting for information from reports by other Member States. As far as we're concerned, it's impossible to offer our imprimatur to those reports or to reject the reports without those data.
Oui, sur la première partie de votre question.
On the first part of your question regarding the 2013 reports, you asked if Member States were aware of the outcome of the JRC reports, and the answer is yes. The JRC reports were public reports and the data were available, and even monitored by all stakeholders, in particular member state representatives who, as the authorities, were responsible for market surveillance. The 2013 report, as in all the work, had its main objective in establishing a credible, robust method allowing for the assessment of real conditions emissions. It was meant to be an innovative approach by avoiding the use of defeat devices to avoid past problems recurring. Certainly they were forbidden, but they were also hard to detect, these devices. I note that the representative of the ICC, when he came to your committee, said that there were innovative elements in the proposal by avoiding the fallback on defeat devices. Were efforts made to draw member states' attention to observance of EU rules, in particular in emissions? Yes, that's the case, because there were also questions we had about the effective nature of market surveillance mechanisms in place. That was discussed in a fairly transparent fashion in the CARS 2020 Working Party, when on a number of occasions we pushed for there to be consideration of the appropriateness of the measures used for market surveillance, and these discussions are what led to a revision of the regulation, which was then adopted by Commissioner Biankowska in January 2016. In 2013, the Commissioner responsible for industry, moreover, wrote to all Member State ministers to ask them to follow closely the market surveillance mechanisms to avoid a watering down of emissions or safety rules. And that letter dates back to July 2013, at the same time, therefore, as the work going on the real driving emissions system. Mr. Eickhout.
No, sorry, we're already 7 minutes, Mrs. Kiriot. I'm very sorry, but we will come back. But I do have to ask the people here, representative of the Commission, to be more to the point and not give lengthy explanations about timings, but be very to the point to the questions. Very small question, Mrs. Kiliotis.
Well, this is precisely my question. We are discussing about the responsibilities of the member states here. And this is something that's mentioned once again in the written answers by the Commission. But what's not clear is what the Commission did. Your group, your team in the Commission, is responsible to monitor what the member states are doing and how they are implementing the EU regulations. So my question is, what action did you take? It is not enough to say that we were waiting for reports from the member states to come and they didn't come. You have to act on your own behalf towards the member states.
Oui, je voudrais.
Yes, well, I didn't want to go into lengthy explanations, but we have an obligation, and it is important to ensure that the obligations are respected. A practical example, and the Parliament has supported the efforts made by the Commission. An example of that is when there was non-application of the regulations on air conditioning. There was decisive action by the Commission to correct the situation and take all necessary steps.
Meneer Eickhout.
Yeah, thank you. To be honest, this is a very disappointing round because you're not giving any true answer, and that is really a problem. And I will be very precise to show where you're not giving the truth. In our written question, was the Commission already aware of temperature sensing software that reduces the efficiency of emission reduction systems in cars? You answer no. Now I go to the famous letter of Mr. Falkenberg 2014, where he's saying that of certain current practices documented extensively by the JRC and others, that certain manufacturers deploy emission abatement techniques that are switched off at low temperatures. That is very clearly that already in 2014 there is a reference to information that was known very well around these techniques. In your written answer you say we were not aware. That is a lie. Or how can I elsewhere read that? And this letter of Mr. Falkenberg is about diesel cars, very clearly. So don't give us false information, because that is really a problem. How can I read this different than that here Mr. Falkenberg is making the point that there are strategies with software to reduce the techniques, abatement techniques?
Maybe we should get a clear answer to that, because no. I already gave all the others plenty of time, because I think it is crucial the difference between the letter of Mr. Falkenberg and answers given by you and other representatives of the Commission to that crucial question.
Yeah, I mean, I can't, of course, call back my memories because I took off. Yeah. But the thing is that at that time, the focus on the work of the Commission services was and had been and was to work on the development of the RDE test, because basically the priority has been to have a test that functions. In the absence of evidence, because I mean, what you mentioned, and I haven't seen that letter, but what you mentioned is basically the fact that there are suspicions and so on, but there is no evidence of a case.
Exactly, but then the continuation of the letter, it's asking to DG Enterprise should investigate the regularity of certain current practices. And then he's coming to this. You should investigate it. That was a question. The reply of DG Enterprise did not answer that at all. So every time when you say there was no concrete proof, it's because you did not put forward an investigation that was asked for.
I mean, at that time, the priority was to develop the RDA test procedure, and as I mentioned, as was mentioned earlier on, I mean, the Commission needs some evidence to act. There was also that recall.
Therefore, you are asked to do an investigation. Then you can get the evidence. Isn't that the idea of an investigation?
The answer is given. There was no priority. The priority was the RDE. Huh?
But then please give that as an answer and don't say there was no proof because you didn't look for it.
Since we were asked to be precise, I'll be very precise, because you seem to allege that I misquoted or I gave you wrong explanation. Actually, the article in The Guardian wrongly quotes the report, while it actually quotes...
I'm talking about the Falkenberg letter.
I'm sorry, because you said I gave you wrong explanation referring to Falkenberg letter. I gave my explanation because that was the question regarding the Guardian article. And the Guardian article makes reference to the minutes, and exactly what I explained concerns this specific passage. So this is not about Falkenberg letter. So let's be precise indeed.
Okay, if we just want to be precise anyhow, can you then explain me your answer to question number 8? Just to show you another thing, that not only you're not precise in answering questions on the investigation, yes or not, you don't even seem to understand your own law. Because in the law, it is saying that the manufacturer shall equip vehicles so that the components likely to affect emissions are designed, constructed and assembled so as to enable the vehicle in normal use to comply with this regulation and its implementing measures. That's the key Article 5 of the Euro 6 regulation. So the cars need to comply in normal use. Then I go to your question your answer to our question 8. You say, since the type approval framework with both the Commission and the national authority of the Member States are implementing and ensuring compliance with requires the NOx limits to be met in the laboratory tests set out in Union law. The law says it needs to comply in normal use. Can you explain me where in the law it is said that it needs to be met in laboratory tests? I checked the law, it's mentioned nowhere. So could you please explain how you are completely changing the letter of the law, written answers to this inquiry committee.
Sure, I will answer your question. So, as you rightly say, Regulation 2007/715 makes reference to normal conditions of use. However, the limits are set against a specific test procedure, because the same regulation obliges the Commission to develop test procedures to test various elements, emissions being one of them. So there's a specific empowerment that makes the Commission adopt test procedures that would allow to measure emissions from the cars, and the test procedure that has been adopted respectively before has been laboratory procedure, and therefore you are right that in terms of, you can say maybe this is not ideal if you have a test procedure with laboratory procedure prescribed by law, and nevertheless there is an obligation to comply with the limits, and then cars do not fulfill fully this requirement, but you cannot also make a case against either regulator or a manufacturer, for that matter, that he complies with the tests that are actually prescribed by law. So I think there's a fundamental difference, because once again we have limits, we have normal conditions of use, we have empowerment to adopt test procedure. In the past, the binding test procedure was laboratory test procedure to measure pollutant emittents, NOx among them. Now, with RDE, we have changed this procedure, exactly exercising the same empowerment, because I believe Article 14 empowers us or mandates the Commission to look into this procedure. So we have changed this procedure. So there is absolutely no contradiction in what you say. According to the letter of law, we are using, or manufacturers were using, the test procedures that was adopted accordingly to the given empowerment.
Just to conclude very briefly, I think we need another round with these people, but only after we've seen all your emails with JRC and other important institutions, because until now we haven't gotten them, and before we can really have a good interchange of explanations.
Mr. Eckert, we'll take that up in the coordinators, but maybe it's also relevant to see the political responsibilities in here. Mr. Zullo.
Thank you. I'm a bit confused about what we're hearing this morning. I feel like we're living in two parallel worlds, really. There's a regulation that's respected, that's interpreted in a certain way. There are priorities that are no longer priorities. I'm not sure if we're really going anywhere with this. And it's quite unfortunate. Apparently there hasn't been evidence about the existence of these defeat devices. But today, not just me, but my colleagues, we have seen everything going all the way back to 2010, seeing that there was a report that was sent by the JSC that led us to believe that the tests that were being carried out might be fraudulent. In 2010 as well, there was a letter that was sent from the Environmental Protection Agency stating that there's been an uptick in terms of illegal practices. In November 2014 as well, another letter from DG Environment to DG Enterprise. So to state that there was no evidence, well, that's very worrisome, I would say. There was a request to make an inquiry to look into this further, and apparently the choice was made to have other priorities, and the procedure didn't resolve anything. That is what is emerging. Again, today, with the replies to the questions, I think that there is additional reason for concern. So there is a problem with emissions related to temperature, the level at which the emissions are related to the temperature. Apparently there hasn't been a concrete way to proceed, but what type of a system is this in Europe if we're going to wait for the damage to be done to be able to do anything or try to prevent that? this morning we understood, I think, to what extent the Commission has made pressure on the member states to try to prevent these types of problems. So my question would really be, or what my request would really be, is if we could change the approach and be more honest in this committee so that we can better understand the practices and that did take place and how we can get beyond them and remediate. One last question as relates to the PEMS. Reply 11. It says that would there be need for a device for compliance with PEMS. Unfortunately, those who produce these devices state that 20 to 30% of uncertainty exists. So my question would be, if there is a low instrumental uncertainty, and considering that we had an uncertainty that went beyond 80%, what other type of elements would have an influence on the measurement if it isn't from the device itself? That's the question that I wanted to raise. Thank you.
It was a whole speech. Please.
The first thing is that I would just like to comment that we are doing our best to give honest replies. I mean, I think that we should not be accused of not being honest in front of this committee. On your specific question, why not?
I think it was explained by Mr. Krasenbrink in the hearing of the JRC. He clearly stated that PEMS equipment for passenger cars needs to be lighter than the one for heavy-duty vehicles. It is being improved, but since it's being used for several hours, the calibration of the instrument can change over this time, and these details need to be improved in order to reduce the uncertainty that you have spoken about. Thank you.
Quindi...
Pardon me. So this overrunner, this higher level, does not come from a study or from any other factor. It was just chosen randomly to set a limit and to remain within that limit given from this instrument. Why do we need to have over 80% and not 50% in terms of the inaccuracy of the instrument?
Thank you very much. So indeed, as you said, there is a certain inaccuracy of the PEMS testing equipment, and I think GRC explained that they looked into these inaccuracies. They made tests, I think, laboratory to laboratory tests. So they checked PEMS equipment in laboratory and weighted it against other equipment also in the laboratory. That gave them approximately, I think, 30% of uncertainty. But then these results were, of course, discussed in the RDE, LDV working group, and there were further comments or analysis made, including that if you are measuring the performance of the equipment in the laboratory, necessarily if you go out, the inaccuracies will be different. So in the end, and this is what the law stipulates, the inaccuracies of order of 50%, but as you know, there is also a revision clause, which means that we assume that measurement equipment will go better, and therefore the inaccuracy will diminish. But to your specific question on the sort of homologation or certification procedure for PEMS, it is an extremely important comment that you made, and I think we concur with that. And actually, we are now reflecting about how to make sure that PEMS equipment can be certified and approved so that it gives homogeneous results across the board.
Okay, thank you very much. Colleagues, that concluded the first round. As you have seen, I've given everybody some extra time. Because I think it's about the answers given and not about the time. But at the end, we need to stop in time, and I need to make sure that we have a sort of level playing field between all the speakers of this committee. So Please stick to the time. We come now to the second round, 5 minutes. The rapporteurs and representatives of the political groups, please stick to the time. Short questions, and please, to the witnesses, to the point and focused short answers. Thank you very much. Mr. Gerber. Then he'll come back. Mr. Karens, can I give you the floor first?
Thank you very much. I'm back. So I'm listening to the discussion. I agreed with what one of our colleagues said, that maybe the focus on the defeat devices is a little bit beyond the point. I mean, we're all familiar with the idea of a stress test, right? We do it for banks to see what happens if there are faulty loans. We do it to check the heart, so taking up static blood pressure is not the same as taking your blood pressure as you're on an exercise bicycle. And the same with vehicle emissions. And now I'm continuing to read because it's something I hadn't read before, so it's still interesting. This summary from your workshop from 2010. And on page 6, it sort of concludes. It says, a special real driving emissions working group with stakeholder member states and industry should be established. In 2010, you write this, or the Commission, which accompanies the development of an appropriate RDE test method for Euro 6 type approvals by the JRC. And then you write, the RDE test method should be available by the end of 2012 for adoption by comitology. The RDE working group should meet the first time in January 2011. So a long time ago, the European Commission not only understood that there's a trade-off between CO2 and NOx, but also understood that the real way to test NOx is not in the lab, but as with, say, the human heart, it's better to test the heart under stress rather than just sitting in a doctor's office when you're calm. Now, I don't doubt the competence of the four of you or the competence of the Commission. I think you're a very competent organization. My question is, what happened? Who stopped this? Why was it stopped? Why could you not do this?
Les travaux n'ont pas été arrêtés.
The work was not stopped. I can give you some information which will help you to understand exactly what was done in order to come up with the method which was more robust. It is true that the work in 2012, 2013 and 2014, first of all, we had to evaluate all of the types of data that we could receive. And in the report in 2013,
all kinds of data, it's always data and you have to evaluate. It's very important. But you yourself said that the test method should be available by the end of 2012. I mean, it seems that in 2010 you had plenty of data saying that, I mean, you knew what the problem was. You knew it very well. And so it seems, I mean, are you indicating that it's such a slow and cumbersome organization that from 2010 to 2017 is fast, and even if you say 2012, or were individuals or member states getting in the way? Were there member states saying no way? Were there commissioners saying no way? Were commissioners aware of this? I mean, who is blocking this? Because it sounds like someone was just being obstructive.
Les travaux ont été plus lents à deux titres.
The work was longer for 2 years. In technical terms, from 2012 to 2013, there were technical difficulties in finding a robust method. The type of work, you can find the detail of everything that was done in the CCR report from 2013. That sets out the detail of all of the steps that were followed month by month for the whole period 2012 to 2013. Setting out the technical method which was being used to come up with a robust, credible system, something which was much more credible than the lab testing. And the second difficulty is a political difficulty. We had to reach agreement with the member states within the TCMV and there we saw difficulties occurring. In 2014 it was more difficult than had been envisaged to reach an majority agreement to get the support from the member states.
Who was obstructing in 2014?
I wouldn't talk about obstruction, I'd talk about difficulties. In order to get a qualified majority vote on a text, which was the objective, you had to have support from a significant number of member states.
States were not giving the support.
Alors, il y avait deux types de...
There were two types of difficulty. There were three categories of member states, if you like. There were member states that were relatively supportive of the objective to get an RDE system very quickly. That was the case, for instance, for countries like Denmark or the Netherlands. And then there were other countries that wanted to have a process which would be examined and which would have a sufficient time to allow the operators to prepare, and that was the position of some countries from the south and the east of the continent. And during the course of the meetings, the number of meetings during which all of these subjects were discussed, there were a large number of meetings of the TCMV. I think it was discussed every month, and we tried to build a consensus which would make it possible in the end to have a majority vote, which we got on the 19th of May 2015.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I find this very difficult to understand. We're living in an era where we are capable of measuring NOx at planet Mars. And at the same time, we need years and years and years to find a way to measure how much NOx is emitted by a car. I think we have 1 billion cars in the world, and that is more difficult than trying to find NOx on the planet Mars. I find it very difficult to believe. You talked about that it was difficult to find a qualified majority for that. That means that the member states were blocking, because this is member states. Can you please give us names of member states that were causing difficulties? And can you also explain why? Because that it's difficult to decrease the amount of emissions in cars, that could be difficult, but not the way to measure it and to find agreement on that. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, the first comment is that member states that were not agreeing either at the origin of when the test itself was developed, I mean the procedure, or then afterwards in October with the limits. I mean, we cannot conclude from then that they were blocking. They were just not agreeing with what was proposed.
Yeah, but for me that's the same, and I'm not talking about last year. I'm talking about 2011, 2012. What happened in those 2 years? Which member states were obstructing development? Why did it go so slowly? I mentioned it a few weeks ago in the Environment Committee when we were discussing this. An 8-year-old kid can understand that if you want to measure what a car is emitting, you have to look at the exhaust pipe. And apparently it took years and years and years for the Commission and Member States to find that wonderful solution. Can you please explain me why?
Pour les années 2012-2013,
for 2012-2013, these were mainly technical discussions within the expert groups, and the detail of all of these discussions, as I said, is contained in the report. There weren't really any discussions about a proposal. It was more about the approach and how we could define the parameters. At the time, on our side at least, there were uncertainties, and perhaps these uncertainties are why the work was slower than expected. But 2012, 2013 are mainly the years in which we were working on the methods, and you can find this in all of the texts proposed by the real discussions with member states started first of all in Cars 2020 to try and have a debate about the data for the introduction of new systems, and then within the TCMV in 2014?
In every question, it seems like the Commission was there but didn't play an active role itself. Why did you allow that to happen? If your objective was to come up with a new system within 2 years, why did you allow to have the debate for 2 years only on technical issues? But I'm not going to get an answer, so I'm not posing that question again. But the attitude of the Commission this morning is we were there, but we didn't play a role. It were the member states and others. But okay, one other question I would like to ask you here, and that is on written question 7. You state that in the Euro 6 regulation there is no explicit requirement for manufacturers to disclose relevant information on whether they use the exemption on the ban on defeat devices. Okay, but in Regulation 692/2008, it says that the manufacturer shall provide the approval authority with, and then I quote, information on the operating strategy of the exhaust gas recirculation system, EGR, including its functioning at low temperatures. So you refer to the Euro 6 regulation from 2007 every time when we discuss the use of defeat devices. Why did you never use the 2008 regulation in order to force manufacturers, maybe through member states, to clarify their use of defeat devices, or at least to clarify why they shut down certain emission abatement technology?
I will try to answer your question. I think, first of all, there is a difference as to the content of the obligation that you quoted, and actually what is now part of the RDE2, and I will come back to it in a second, because this is exactly the declaration made by the manufacturer. And this is what we introduced precisely to oblige manufacturers to declare what they were not obliged to do explicitly under the current law. Regarding the obligation that you mentioned, this is the one that is best answered by type approval authorities, because they are supposed to verify this sort of information. So manufacturer has to supply type approval authority with a statement concerning the system that protects the engine, and this is for type approval authority to verify. So I believe the ones that are in the best position to inform you about whether they have done this or not are type approval authorities of the member states. But also to complement this answer, today with the introduction of the second RDE package, we explicitly request manufacturers to declare what we call base and auxiliary emission
Yes, I know,
strategies.
but this is 2008 regulation. That's pretty old. So apparently you say ask the question to the type approval authorities, because we as Commission are not aware of the use of this regulation.
No. What I'm saying is that there is a chain of responsibilities, and when it comes to type approval, because the system is decentralized, it is a type approval authority of the given member state that approves the car that is obliged to verify this information.
It's hopeless.
Thank you. Mr. Karens, brief, please.
I'll give the floor to Mr. Giesecke.
Okay.
Ich muss meinen Kollegen Karins mal wenig entlasten.
I have to take over from my colleague, Mr. Karens. He's already asked a lot of good questions. As a member of EPP, I have to agree today with Bas Eickhout, because this hearing today is giving us not that much helpful information. Perhaps I could just summarize. We have noted, Mr. Koziko, that since 2007, NOx emissions for diesel have been very high, and we have this is something which covered by comitology, even though citizens aren't necessarily aware of all of the details of comitology, but that was covered in 2011, and then there's a solution, an RDE system, in 2015, and it's only really to come into force in 2017. So 2007, you're aware of the problem, and then it's taking 10 years to get the system implemented in Europe. how do you evaluate that work yourself, the fact that this has taken 10 years?
First, I think I have to precise my answer, the information that was provided by my colleagues, myself, in terms of that we've got a common understanding of what we said at least. The fact that NOx emissions are a problem is well known. They're not regulated since 2013-14. They were regulated already. They've been regulated by the pre-existing legislation. They've been regulated for years. What has been the problem is that the test that was actually in function was found not to correspond to the real driving emissions. So basically to the emissions in the reality. And that's the problem that we identified. And from there on, work was undertaken. It was actually quite a complex technical work, and that lasted probably longer than we would have hoped. But the work was done on establishing a test that actually allows to measure real driving emissions. And that's what we've been doing. But we cannot say that we knew about the existence of NOx emissions. We knew about their consequences and the fact that they were a problem and that we didn't act for all those years. That's not true. We actually knew about the NOx emissions. The legislation was passed. Even the risk of defect devices was known and they were prohibited. From there on, there was an issue with the tests that were developed because it was found inaccurate.
Darf ich ganz
and
kurz
there
unterbrechen?
the work was
Could I just interrupt very briefly?
Darf ich ganz kurz unterbrechen?
I'd just like to interrupt. I didn't say that you didn't do anything. That's not what I said at all. But you did things, that's true. But perhaps you would agree with me that a time frame between recognition of the problem to the legislative answer so from 2007 to 2010, 10 years. I mean, the communists worked with 10-year plans, but is that appropriate for the Commission?
Allow me to comment perhaps as an outsider now. I'm a retired official. I have not been dealing with car legislation for the last 10 years. I'm observing this from outside. When I was head of the car unit, we were aware of the weakness of the test at the time, but it was not a weakness observed in the area of NOx emissions, but in the area of fuel consumption. Consumers knew that their car required more fuel than the official test would indicate. Nevertheless, the Commission supported the UN ECE committee at the time to order a new test cycle, and it took 10 years. It took 10 years to come to that new test cycle. It's the World Light Duty test cycle that will enter into force next year. When I compare that with what my successors have done at the Commission, you say it has also taken 10 years. It's not quite true. From what I have heard, and I've heard it more or less in the same way as you have, the work started in 2011, so it's 5 years. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Mrs. Schaldemose. So sorry.
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, I suppose it goes for everyone here that we are a bit frustrated because we're trying to find out what happened, hopefully mostly in order to make sure that this will not happen again. And seen from my perspective, you knew that we had problems. You were worried about the defeat devices, but still you did not really do anything because you had no proof. You said, fair enough. But did you try to bring that discussion into the TAEGG, the forum between the member states and the European Commission? Did you bring up your concern and that you thought there was a risk of defeat devices manipulation? Did you bring that on to TAEGG?
La réponse est non. Il n'y a pas eu de...
The answer is no. There was no discussion on defeat devices within the type approval authorities.
You knew that there was a risk, and still you did not bring it up in a forum where you had the member states there, and you had to exchange best practices, etc., etc. Why didn't you bring it up when you had this?
Deux explications.
There are two explanations. Firstly, we need to go back to 2010 to understand. Our concern was to have better knowledge of the practices by type approval authorities. The group was established in 2010 precisely to cover the gap in information on what type approval authorities were doing. The second thing is that in all recent years, the TAAEG group discussions were always prompted by questions raised by type approval authorities or member state representatives. And it so happens that these devices weren't raised by any of the stakeholders, organisations, member states or surveillance authorities in the group.
The problem you could have taken up, the problem you were concerned, you knew that there was this risk, but okay, you didn't, and now we stand here today. Well, many of you have already made a proposal for a new type approval system, and you still keep on having this decentralized system where you leave it up to the member states to do a lot. Taking a look behind and see what happened, do you really believe that the decentralized system is the best way to make sure that we will not see cheat in the future, and that we can make sure that the cars will live up to our legislation? I have my personal doubts, I must say.
Yeah, you probably make reference to our proposal. I mean, the first thing I would say is I would like to point out to the improvements that that proposal foresees. I'm not talking about defeat devices there because we're dealing with that with the introduction of RDE. As far as the reform is concerned, when you will examine the text, you will see that the definition of the responsibilities between different players is considerably more precise than it used to be in the existing legislation, be it for manufacturers, be it for type approval authorities, being the technical services that they use. We also reinforce the market surveillance measures. It also provides for a coherent reaction by member states in case of non-compliance, which is not the case today with the existing legislation. It introduces deterrence, both on manufacturers who would be unscrupulous or on underperforming technical services. And it provides sanctions at EU level. All that doesn't exist at the moment. And it obliges manufacturers to provide access to data on the software of vehicles, which will allow external checks. This is for what is proposed. What you refer to is why still a decentralized system, and I would say that when considering the possibility of creating a European agency, this approach was discarded mainly for three reasons. The first reason is that it takes time to create an agency. And we wanted to be fast in reaction. The second one is the cost of it. And the third one is that we have an infrastructure in place with both approval authorities and technical services, which is a big infrastructure, which will actually be difficult to replace and actually will bring more time. And that's the main reasons why it was discarded.
But fair enough, we have a system in place, but it did not function. It did not find out the problems we had here. So isn't it better to, shake it up all and make a new system more centralized? I believe that, but let's have that discussion in the future and in IMCO.
Sorry for my non-intended reaction, but the argument of time in this context is sometimes a little bit out of balance, I have to say. Mr. Henkel.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question to Mrs. Tchaikovská. You probably have heard about our futile attempts to invite the then Vice President Verheugen to this committee. And looking at your CV, I find out that you have been working with him. You were a member of the cabinet of Günther Verheugen. And I have a little question. Do you recall having talked to him about the issue we are discussing here?
Well, the answer is very short, no.
Do you recall that he has had discussions with others on this subject?
Well, I will have to answer no to any of the questions if they continue to be the same. So let me maybe set the scene. I've been working for Commissioner Verheugen for 2 years, between 2007 and 2009. I was not in charge of the portfolio that is today the subject matter of the hearing, and I've never had a chance, an opportunity, and the need to discuss this topic with him before, neither today.
Okay, thank you. Then I have a question to Monsieur Jean. Monsieur Jean, you have sent us your biography, like everybody else, but to my great surprise, you did not say there what did you do between 2002 and 2015. Now, I suggest you deliver this information to us a little later, but it may, of course, be of interest what you have been doing in the context of what we have been saying here. Now to a question of substance. When the Commission decided on the conditions of Euro 5 and Euro 6, you didn't have information like you got later from the real driving emissions, light duty tests and so on. But you have that information now. And my question is, do you believe it is necessary to change those standards in either direction? Because we have been finding out that the gap between the making those tests and the standards is growing. So the question is, are you working on changing those standards for 5 and 6?
If the question is whether we are presently working on a Euro 7 legislation, the answer is no. But what we are working on is, and that's public knowledge, is development of RTE, WLTP, which was for CO2, the reform of the type approval regime, and plenty of other legislations, including relating not only on safety.
Okay. Now, most of the cars which are on our roads are a couple of years old. I don't know what the average age is, 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, something like this. What are we doing to make sure that a test which shows good results when the car is getting on the road are also good when they are on the road for a number of years?
Thank you for the question. It's indeed a very fundamental question because, as you know very well, the legislation today is conceived in a way that verifies cars before they are placed, or the moment they are placed on the market, but it's relatively weak on verifying performance of the car once it's being in service. So the package of the legislation that we've been discussing today, being type approval or RDE legislation, is exactly the answer to the question, meaning that in the first place we will establish in-service verification tests to be done by member states, by type approval authorities, by the Commission, by JRC more precisely. So this is in terms of type approval framework. And we also plan to develop this concept in the third package of RDE legislation. We'll be talking about in-service conformity and third-party verification checks. So indeed, this is what is currently in the pipeline.
Mr. Federley.
Thank you so much. I think that the hearing is very interesting, and I've been changing my questions to you several times during the hearing. We've been talking a lot about the dates. When did we actually know something, and when did procedures start, and why did it take so long time? But I recall our hearing with the European Environmental Agency. They said that they had published in a report already 2004 that there was huge discrepancies between what was believed to be the emissions and what were the actual emissions. That means that we are actually back to at least 2004, as we have a publication stating that we do have a problem with the issue. Today, we date 2016. That gives us 12 years of us not being able to actually enforce the legislation that we do have in place. Following it of my S&D colleague, I'm trying to get to the core of the issue and see what actually went wrong and how can we make sure that we do not do it again. So I'm trying to put a few straight questions, not on actual procedures, but on power balance and on the legislation. Would you say that there is a problem with the division of power between the Council and the Commission on this legislation?
It's difficult for me to express a personal judgment on that, but probably the situation is not so much a question of a problem of balance between the Commission and Council on that on the fact that the system which is in place today is not really satisfactory in terms of the type approval legislation. It's actually a bit too lenient, and that's actually one of the reasons why we decided to modify it, and that also explains a lot of the modifications I was mentioning earlier on in terms of what we absolutely want to improve in this reform. Actually, to reinforce, for example, the fact that the supervision of manufacturers are not made only by one member state, but basically there are also common attitude, the fact that the Commission has an increased role in the whole process, and that actually sanctions can be applied at European level and not only at national level, the fact that there is exchange of information, coherence implementation by member states. So that's from that point of view, I think the legislation needs to be improved. It's probably more than a question of balance between Commission and Council.
Were you aware of the report by the EEA in 2004 saying that there were issues on the fact, and did you act already in any way in 2004?
Sorry, it's a long time ago, and I cannot say today whether in 2004 this or that report was sitting on my desk and whether I've read it. We certainly made proposals to reduce NOx emissions. The Commission, as you may recall, originally proposed only Euro 5. The Council and the Parliament insisted to have a second, tougher stage of emission limits in the form of Euro 6. The Commission supported that. So these limits were approved. Let's be clear what we're talking about. We're talking about NOx emissions that may have been higher than they should have been. We were not talking about defeat devices at the time.
To follow up with a really short one, Madam Chair, it's getting clearer and clearer to me that we have a system which is overcomplicated and where we do not have the proper mechanisms, because the report by the EEA was also publicly is published so that the European Parliament can also take up procedures, and we did not. So obviously several parts have a part of the error that we are trying to correct now. But what should the procedures in your eyes look? How would you form procedures if there is a published report saying that our legislation is not being followed due to defeat devices, due to something else? It's actually not the matter of defeat devices at the moment, but where you can see a discrepancy with the target set down in legislation and the actual outcome. In order to have a cooperation on the European Union level, we have to make sure that our legislation is actually being followed. And if agencies say that there is a discrepancy here, how should we create a mechanism that makes sure that we actually start taking action, making sure that legislation passing this House and passing the Council is actually being followed?
Let me comment as a semi-outsider, and I'm here for the first time in this committee. I sense a strong frustration of the committee because it is of the opinion that the Commission did not investigate the issue of defeat devices. This is one part of the problem, and I recognize that you would have preferred that the Commission was more active and went further and so forth and so on. Okay. There's a second part of the problem, and that is what are we going to do and what has the Commission done in order to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And in that respect, I have to say, again, as an observer from outside, I was amazed that the Commission came up with a solution, namely the second RDE proposal, basically 10 days after the Volkswagen scandal broke out. And actually, as we have all seen, the first RDE regulation was adopted before that scandal broke. So I think it would be unfair to say that the Commission hasn't done its job. It has done a good job in one area, and I think it is the more promising area, i.e. the one that will avoid that similar problems will occur in the future. And the legislation that we are adopting is covering thousands of potential cases. So you're looking into the past, into one individual case concerning defeat devices. It's your right to do that, but it's a very, very limited and isolated approach.
Thank you. Mr. Turmes.
Thank you very much. I have first a question on the method. Here we have 4 civil servants of Commission who tell us nice stories, and in the same moment Commission has refused to give us relevant documents from the same very person. So we have received 7 pages of documents in the period 2011 to 2013. Come on, are you kidding? Are you taking us for fools? So you must have had hundreds of exchanges, because between 2011 and 2013 was a very heated period because industry tried to prevent PAMs. So I think the first thing which I don't accept as somebody who is sitting here is that there seems to be a deliberate strategy of Commission not to give us documents, so we cannot verify what is said here orally. And just on the last reply, Mr. Pettinelli had done a roadmap on when the conformity factor decision was to be taken. In that roadmap, it was June 2014. So saying that Commission, after in US the thing exploded, then suddenly was able to act in 10 days, that shows exactly it was only the scandal in US which basically brought enough pressure to Commission to deliver, because everything was possible before. So I want to come back to one mail which is crucial, which is a mail 2008, DG Envy asks GSC, please measure Volkswagen and other European diesel cars which now have launched a clean diesel strategy in US, and did GSC measure these European diesels which went to the US market? The question is, DG Envy asked to GSC, please, and that's interesting. So already in 2008, DG Envy was curious about what kind of technology VW would use in US to comply with the stricter US standards. So there's a mail, which is in the few mails we got from Commission, showing that DG Envy asks for this to be done by GSC. Has this ever been done? Yes. And if not, why not?
I think the colleagues, all the colleagues you've got here come from, are or were with DG GROW, and actually you're talking to us about a mail from DG NV to DG RC. The best place to answer that would be either of the two, either the sender or the receiver of that mail.
Everybody knows that DG NV has the right to ask GRC, but that GRC is always depending on you. So no, you should. I'm pretty sure the day where we get access to all the mails which we have asked, we will be able to show that you are lying on this point, that you were perfectly aware of that mail from DG Envy, because it would be surprising that DG Envy would not have copied into that mail. Why would they not have copied you in, knowing that if GRC would inquire, that they would have afterwards to basically depend on you to have the go for it?
I don't remember this exchange of information, but I can do my best in order to investigate and to provide, I should say, the follow-up which was done in DG GROW at that time with regard to this exchange of correspondence and provide to your committee.
So back to 2007-8, when exactly had GRC done the tests on the Euro 5 cars? Because you stipulate that there were no cars which they could have measured. So when exactly were the 14 cars, or what was it, measured by GRC? So is that early 2009, mid 2009, and 2009? When was it? Yeah. And don't tell me that you will not remember, because that was a bomb. Everybody, come on, this was a big splash, and you will not remember when that was done. Sorry.
The tests which has been reported afterward by GRC were done at for the period 2009-2010.
When exactly? When exactly? Because I have the damned impression of the following. GRC's tests were done, GRC's study was ready, and DG Enterprise vetoed the publication of that test. And that must have been end of 2009, beginning of 2010. We lost more than a year after the tests were ready. And that was your responsibility.
If you don't remember exactly the date, we can get it in writing.
No, but say you refuse to give us the mails of that period. That's the problem.
We'll get it. We'll get that. We'll get that.
Well, I can't give you the exact months when the GRC started testing the cars. What I can tell you is that when it comes to the study from 2010, so the first part of the study that was published in 2011, it was done on the very explicit request of the colleagues at the time in DG Enterprise. So the request to test the cars and to conduct the study came from DG Enterprise in 2009. Now, GRC tested cars in two tranches. The first, if I remember well, they tested 13 cars or 11 cars, and then for the next study, another 3 cars. But what they were also looking at was a variety of cars. So they didn't look at diesels, they also look at hybrid cars, they also look at petrol cars, so there was a variety of cars. And the studies were published subsequently as they were coming. So the request, as I said, was from 2009, and the study was published in 2011. Yes, it was this.
Okay. Claude.
Because you vetoed the publication of the study before. You first forced GRC to organize the workshop. And then, because you were so afraid of the test results, then you imagined the RDE working group so that when the test would go out, that you would be able to show that you have taken a similarity of an action.
Okay. Yes or no?
Of course not.
And with regard, but that's for all members of the committee, we had the discussion on the access to documents and so on. We will have that in the afternoon with the coordinates, with some discussions on the confidentiality and so on. But we will put the pressure very high in order to solve that problem, Mr. Termes, the access to documents.
Good, but so...
No. Mr. Zullo.
It's always a good try.
Grazie.
Previously, you discussed the UNECE procedure. So my request, or my question would be, why did the Commission take the definition of this new procedure and the WLTP, more specifically, why did they decide to base themselves on this system when a recent study shows that measuring CO2 using this system likely underestimates the level? So why did the Commission decide Artemis, that system, was also one that was the EEA thought would be useful and was the one that was suggested by that body. So why did it choose not to use Artemis? Thank you.
Perhaps just one comment before we answer your question. No, I mean, but the thing is that just on the documents, we've transmitted 129 documents between April and May. So it's true that there is a discussion on the confidential one, but it's not true that, I mean, we should not give the impression that there were only 7 documents transmitted. There's almost 130 in 2 months.
No, we're not going to start that discussion. We will get there. And please,
as far as WLTP is concerned, I personally can't answer. No, so we could provide you with a reply in writing if you agree, because none here seems to be able to answer your question.
You will get the answer in writing. Do you want to continue? It's okay? Okay. Concludes the second round. Dear colleagues, we go now to the last round of speakers of 3 minutes. We're a little bit behind schedule, so please stick to the time. First, Mr. Niedermayer.
Thank you very much. I will try to be disciplined. I have 2 questions. The first question, actually, question number 0 is if you feel so frustrated as we are, but I am not waiting for the answer. But the first question relates to a comment made by one of the speakers concerning previous problems with CO2 measurement and consumption measurement. And obviously we know that there are significant differences in CO2 and consumption in laboratory driving. Some are caused by objective factors, some are caused by driving style, but for many years we know exactly what kind of adjustment of cars for the measurement is used by the manufacturers. For example, there is a report, Mind the Gap, I guess from 2003. Now, through Google, I have seen the article in BBC concerning very precise things, how manufacturers are adjusting the cars for this kind of measurement. So I guess here we cannot say that there was not sufficient evidence, and obviously as the consequence of this, the results were completely misleading. So let me if you can remind me, what was at that time a reaction of the Commission, and how we make sure that this will not repeat in the future. And the second question concerns to defeat devices. We are talking about a lot of defeat devices, and also if you just survey the publication of the press in the last few years, there were many serious suspicions of defeat devices, much less sophisticated than that one used by Volkswagen, like the devices that were just analyzing the comparison of driving with no movement of steering wheel, the temperature, and GPS being off because laboratories are in closed buildings. And these all things can be used for adjusting the so-called emission strategy of the engine. So I wonder if in the past you were looking at that very simple evidence of effort of car manufacturers to actually get a different result in laboratory, different emission strategy in laboratory compared to emission strategy of engines in cars. Thank you.
Okay. Regarding the first question, so the differences between CO2 and fuel consumption, what have been done, what has been done? We relied this time on the work that has been carried out in Geneva, so the UN Forum, and the work there started actually in 2009. In 2014, the respective law has been adopted, so in March 2014 we had regulation that foresees new, more precise tests measuring CO2 emissions. This regulation has been transposed into the EU law within 2 years, so we have adopted respective texts last week, and this text will be sent to the Parliament and the Council for scrutiny. So the answer is very clear. We were aware about discrepancies. We have taken immediate action both at international level and at EU level. We have transposed the respective regulation into our law, and we don't stop work now, which means it will enter into force. We'll monitor the measurement of the CO2, and if there will be a need to go further, because WLTP, this is what it's called as a laboratory test, we'll take steps if indeed the practice will show that this is necessary.
Sorry, very simply, does it mean that the measures used in past and as was highlighted in Mind the Gap report will be illegal, and since when?
No, they will not be illegal. The measurements have been current limit values have been established based on the test cycle, which is still valid, so in a DSIC test. And there is a transitional period during which the measurements will be still valid. They will be correlated with the new test procedures. This new test procedures is being now worked out by our colleagues from DG Klima, and the law will be presented very soon. So for the transitional period, there will be, as we call it, the correlation exercise between the two procedures. And as of 2018, September 2018, cars will have to be approved according to the new test procedure, more accurate test procedure.
Thank you very much. Mr. Zorinho.
On the defeat device?
Then in writing. Mr. Zorinho.
Muito obrigado. Voltemos. Preciso mudar a interpretação. Voltemos então ao estudo de impacto para o programa Ar Limpo na Europa.
When it came to the impact study and the program that was published in 2013, apparently there's no proof that there was a defeat device being used, but the study was referenced this morning, and I'll read it in English.
Is increasing evidence of illegal practice by some end users that defeat the anti-pollution systems to improve driving performance or save on the replacement of costly components. Então, para os senhores que escreveram isto, não havia...
So those who wrote this stated that there was no proof. What does this mean? It means that this study is not credible. So you received it, but apparently it wasn't credible. So why was this study used? Why was it used to flag this up to the member states when there was a proof of the violations of NOx emissions levels? So apparently there was a double standard. So the study did not have consequences. This is incredible, really, but apparently it did on the member states when the member states were finally involved. And why was that? Thank you.
Ce qui était en cause, je dirais, le plus important pour nous, c'était la détermination.
The most important thing for us was the determination that we had to change the method of verification for emissions. The procedure which applied and still applies couldn't just be tweaked on the margins. We had to have a radical rethink of it, a totally different approach. And the report that you quoted is one which showed that it really was urgent to come up with a new system of measuring real emissions.
Fine, but you said that you weren't aware of the fact that there were defeat devices and continued to maintain that position. Do you continue to maintain this position that you didn't know that these devices were on board?
Well, we were aware of the fact that they were prohibited and also something that could potentially be used, and that is why the new system wanted to reduce the potential for use of these devices.
Eu posso concluir que os senhores...
Therefore, I conclude that you were aware that the defeat devices existed. So that's already something. So you knew that. Did you know that?
There was a risk. We were aware of the fact that there was a risk of there being devices.
Köszönöm szépen, elnök asszony. Először is az első megjegyzésem az, hogy mi nem frusztráltak.
Thank you.
Végezni, és mindannyian azt szeretnénk, hogyha ezt releváns.
In order to do your work, we all need to base things on true information, true data. But it is not our committee that is asking for the information, but it is the Commission that has to provide this information to us and in writing. It's a little bit strange that information which is available did not make it possible to avoid the scandal. It's rather strange that it was necessary to have a scandal in order for the Commission to make changes to the legislation and to the system. And I'm listening to what your responses to that are. Now, my first question on the expert group that deals with the standards. What could the expert group achieve in terms of harmonizing standards? With regard to Regulation 715/2007 and the defeat devices, the criteria really aren't very clear. And that means that manufacturers can interpret that in a way that suits them. You mentioned that it was necessary to change the regulation. Did you take steps to ensure that this would happen? And then my second question is once again on defeat devices. The definition that the US has of defeat devices is very different from the definition that we use in the EU. And NGOs have noted this. The Transport Council confirmed this. Could you explain to us the advantages and disadvantages of the different definitions?
Perhaps on what we're doing in order to avoid that situation, I would mention first the fact that we introduced the RDE test, which actually is a real driving conditions test, which doesn't make it possible or reduces considerably the risk of any defeat devices. The second thing, and I think it was mentioned, but it needs to be underlined, manufacturers will be obliged to declare their control strategy, actually to give the information. And there will also be the obligation with the obligation, and that is in the type approval reform, they will be obliged to actually provide their software to the type approval authorities, so that actually basically to publish it, so that basically in-service use and checks, independent checks, can be made. On US definition, perhaps, Joanna?
Very brief. Very brief. So, 2 points you made, that the definition in 715 is not clear. We believe that the definition is very clear. It can be implemented already today by the manufacturer and by the approval authorities. The definition is very clear. What is needed is the common interpretation, and this is what we are working on. And to your point, what we'll need to follow up and the link with the US rules, actually the US law and the EU law as regards the definition is very much the same. EU definition has been based on the EU law, on US law, so they reflect each other. There is no difference. There is a difference in follow-up. And as has been explained, the follow-up is, for example, with a declaration of the engine protection strategy. So this is the second RD package. And eventually clarification as to how to interpret the law and how to implement the definition. But otherwise, the framework is the same.
This is wonderful.
Oui, je voulais savoir. I just wanted to know, with regard to the TAAEG, with the previous regulation, it was possible for the Commission to put items on the agenda?
La réponse est oui.
The response is yes. Question, well, in that case, at any point did you envisage or actually put on the even amendment to 715, 207, particularly Articles 5 and 3, so as to have an opportunity to discuss this with the national authorities and the type approval authorities with regard to the non-compliance? And so I would like to know, did you have an opportunity to talk up to follow up to the letter which is referenced in question number 8 with regard to 5 and 13?
Scheduled discussions regarding the problem of application of Regulation 715 or defeat device in a broader sense, as you wish. We had 3 meetings since last October. So we had 1 meeting in October, 1 meeting in February, and 1 meeting actually last week, where we discussed various issues related to the practice, to the definition, to the necessity of having correct interpretation. So exactly the topics that can be dealt with at a forum that the purpose of which is to give joint interpretation.
But I think that the mail sent by the Commission was prior to that. So prior to that, were there not items on the agenda of the TAAEG? It's only since the Volkswagen affair occurred that that was put on the agenda? A response, no. There were no questions on interpretation of the regulation for 2012-2013. So it's a regulation from 2007, but you waited for the Volkswagen affair to put this on the agenda. But you are the institution working together with the national authorities and the member states that would be able to do this. But you didn't do it?
L'enceinte où il y a eu des...
The body where there were discussions about the system is the other committee, and there were regular discussions about the implementation of Euro 5 and Euro 6.
Moi, ce qui m'intéresse vraiment...
But what I really want to know is 715/2007. That is what we're looking at, and that's why I'm asking that question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regarding the regulation 715/2007, I want to ask about Article 5.2, which says exemptions which allow the use of defeat devices, as we're discussing them, where the devices reducing the emission control system. Point A, use to protect the engine and safe operation of the vehicle. Can you explain specific cases, the way it's meant? Because it seems a very broad, it seems to have a very broad scope of application. So, what is the specific explanation? How is this intended? The way if I just read it like this, it seems a very to have a very broad scope of application. Article 5, paragraph 2.
Thank you for the question. I will try to illustrate the application of this exemption with one example, and of course we can provide you with any other possible cases where this exception could be used. But the one we can think of, which is pretty obvious, is when, for example, the the car is overtaking another car, it needs full power engine. And that will be one situation where the system that is reducing emissions could be temporarily deactivated. So there are cases which justify either based on safety reasons or protection of the engine that indeed this can be used. But once again, as any exception, they have to be applied in a very restrictive manner. And obviously, we are very willing to provide you with more cases, and we'll do it in writing.
Mr. Giesecke.
Ja, vielen Dank nochmal, Frau Vorsitzende.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Mr. Schulterbanks. We've heard that he has retired. But my question is something which goes back to the pact, so it's good that you're here with Mr. Schulterbanks. With the regulation in 2007 for Euro 5, Euro 6, there was the Commission was told to revise the test cycles, and then the RDE group was set up in 2011. Why did it take so long?
Ja, mein Kollege Philippe Jean, der dafür zu...
Philippe Jean, who looked after this once I moved on to a new position, has already provided the answer to that question. The regulation says, expresses verbis, that the new test procedure for Euro 5 and Euro 6 limit values was to be created. So vehicles needed to be available which were working in accordance with those limit values, and those vehicles were only available from 2009 to 2010. So you're saying 2009? So we could have started with the working group in 2009. Response: yes, we explained that from 2009, the JRC started to carry out the corresponding tests, and as soon as the results of the tests were available, if I've understood correctly, that is when the working group was set up. A follow-up question. We nevertheless have the feeling that there wasn't things weren't moving that quickly, and that is perhaps why Commissioner Verheugen has said that he doesn't want to appear. We're waiting for a response. Now, Mr. Verheugen would be a good person to respond to our questions, but if he doesn't come, who would you recommend? Perhaps Mrs. Erle? There are other colleagues from the Commission that you think we could hear from if Commissioner Verheugen doesn't come to speak to us.
Die Fragen, die Sie jetzt gestellt...
Response. Well, the questions you have just asked, I think, have been answered by Philippe Jean today.
Gefragt, ob Sie andere Personen...
I just asked whether or not you have other people, other names that you could put to us, heads of unit. You can send a list. You don't have to do that. Mr. Jean can do that, but it could be submitted in writing.
À nous d'indiquer.
Well, it is not up to us to provide information of that type, and I would also draw your attention to the need to protect personal data. Mr. Dante.
Bene, grazie.
Thank you very much. I've been astounded by the fact that a third of the compliance texts are done in 3 countries that aren't major countries of major automobile manufacturing. Luxembourg's 1,000 tests out of 1,000 and some 1,000 vehicles in 2014, and then Malta as well. In your reply to number 2, you really emphasize a point that this takes place because there are less stringent or different conditions that are implemented in the various member states. So what I should like to understand is exactly what these differences are, what these different parameters are. So in the national test, what are the different types of parameters that apply in the various member states? And what have you done over the course of the last few years? Apparently, there have been a number of different reports of vehicles that have been moved from north to south for test purposes, or from the south to the north, or they have a general overarching test in one country and then the emissions test is carried out in another country. So what have you done in order to monitor this over the course of the last few years? Thank you.
The first thing I can reply is that to say that the reports have been done by countries that are not major countries where type approval are delivered is not fully true, because if Luxembourg is number one, Germany is number two. So, I mean, and Germany has done a report. But concerning the situation in certain member states that deliver quite a lot of type approval and differences.
Ho detto il Lussemburgo, non la Germania.
I said Luxembourg, not Germany.
L'evidenza che era il
I said Luxembourg. I was emphasizing the fact that it was Luxembourg, Germany, clearly.
Those who deliver, those who made reports are not delivering a lot of type approvals. That's what I was reacting, because actually Germany, who has prepared the report, delivers a lot of type approvals. But as far as Luxembourg and similar member states are concerned that issue a lot of type approvals, I think there are different factors that can explain that. And notably the internal organization for a type approval authority. Some type approval authorities, for example, are financed directly on the basis of the number of approvals they deliver. As far as Luxembourg is concerned, or Malta is concerned, the two member states you mentioned, it's for the authorities to give you a detailed explanation. But according to the legislation, the EU legislation, the designation of type approval authorities is the responsibility of member states. So we do not have at the Commission a right to intervene on that, and the legislation does not foresee specific requirement for the type of approval authority to verify before giving that mandate. Moreover, in some cases, or in most cases, the type approval authorities are not those that perform the tests. I mean, they give that task to technical services. That either can be private, they can be semi-public, they can even be sometimes outside of the member states of the type approval authority. Which explains that certain type approval authorities can deliver quite a high number of approvals with limited resources. I'll draw your attention of the reforms and amendments we are doing with the type approval reform we have proposed now. Basically reinforced rules for designation of technical services, reinforced rules on type approval authorities, and the fact that the Commission itself will have a reinforced test with the possibility to do its own test and to participate to the audits.
Okay. Too long.
Sorry
too long. And the questions maybe as well, but Mr. Gerbrandy.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be very brief in my question. I'll come back to the type approval regulation from 2008, when I, in my previous question, asked about the necessity of manufacturers to provide the approval authorities with information on the EGRs. The answer was that I should address the type approval authorities and not the Commission. But the same Article 3 of this regulation says, and I quote, "At the request of the Commission, the approval authority shall provide information on the performance of NOx after-treatment devices and EGR system at low temperatures." I assume that this is put in this regulation not for nothing, so there must be a reason for that. Did the Commission, based on all the information it had received, as we have read again in The Guardian yesterday, did the Commission ever use this article in the type approval regulation from 2008?
Je ne pense pas.
I don't think so. I don't think that we use that provision. But what we can do is check and send you confirmation of that answer in writing.
Okay, please do so. And my further question is, in answer on question 8, you said that in 2012 the Commission has sent letters to all member states stressing the need to enhance market surveillance mechanisms and to ensure that member states have the necessary structures, etc., etc. Was there a specific reason for sending this letter? I guess there was, and if so, how did the member states respond? And did the Commission do any follow-up after 2012 based on the responses by the member states?
La raison de l'envoi de cette lettre, c'est...
The reason for that is the discussions in CARS 2020, where there were questions which were asked about the effective implementation of market surveillance tools. And so the letter was sent. We can give the detail of the responses which were sent by some members, because some member states responded about the specific provisions that they had taken with regard to market surveillance. Now, one of the consequences of the letter and the discussions that took place on the analysis of the responses is the work that was undertaken to fundamentally revise the 2007-46 regulation, where we saw that this did not correspond to the market surveillance that was necessary with regard to the procedures for the environment and safety.
I would like to perhaps approach this from a different angle. So we've been speaking about the Commission, questions for the Commission, but of course our constituents are going to ask about the role that we in the European Parliament played. And President Schulz was one of the driving forces of setting up this inquiry committee, but where exactly were his statements in the period running up to this scandal? I don't remember the European Parliament calling any type of attention to this. Maybe someone could inform me on this. But of course, you all know of Mr. Schultz's political activities, so I won't inform you of them more. But when it comes to the European Parliament, in the report cards 2020, in the drafting of that, so as to written comments and oral questions on that subject, and the Parliament was invited to CARS 21, the high-level meeting that was proposed by Tajani. The Parliament rejected that, and I wonder if you could remember what underpinned that entire story. Thank you very much.
Plusieurs niveaux.
Well, at different levels, I think the Parliament should be aware of the reasons that it decided not to participate in CARS 2020. But perhaps it is more important to recall that following the work of CARS 2020, there was a communication from the Commission which was sent to the Parliament and which was discussed in the Parliament and was covered by a resolution. And the strategy for real conditions measurement of emissions is something that was covered in the communication and was debated at the time of the resolution. I think that's all I need to say at the moment.
Cada comparecencia surge.
So new indications of the national authorities' understanding of the situation, as well as shortcomings in terms of the Commission's reply. So 3 questions. We have seen that when RDE was going to be implemented, there were 3 blocks of country that were asking for some agility, more time. Denmark was mentioned, and others that were obstacles. So which countries were those? Which countries were those exactly?
This is the type of information that can. This is the type of information that can be transmitted to the by the Commission to the committee under the respect of the confidentiality agreement that is being discussed at the moment, from what I understand.
Muchas gracias. No deba...
Thank you very much. Well, some were used as examples. Other from the south asked for more time, and then the third block that erected obstacles, well, apparently we have to wait for that information, so I don't really understand the confidentiality as to that. In the technical committee meeting, had any member state raised the alarm as to the existence of defeat devices, as if there was reason to believe that they were being used by some manufacturers?
À ma connaissance, jamais.
Never to my knowledge.
¿Podían poner a disposición?
Could you give us the minutes from those technical meetings, please?
This is actually what I referred to in my earlier question, which in my earlier reply is basically that we transmit within the limits of the confidentiality agreement of that is being discussed at the moment between the committee and the Commission.
In any case, these documents will be available either in the confidential reading room or not. That's the discussion, but they will be available tomorrow? Looking at the wrong part. Well, we have coordinators this afternoon, and after that we will communicate to you how we deal with that. Okay.
No, le hacía estas dos preguntas.
So the questions that I raised, and then I have a third that links up to the first two. So the first was, which countries erected obstacles? No answer. Now, as to the minutes, no reply. And then the last question, since the scandal, is it surprising that things move so quickly and that we could implement RDEs? It confuses me slightly as to this.
Mrs. Deli. Sorry.
Merci. Je vous ai bien.
Thank you very much. I've been listening to you very keenly. I'm quite surprised by one thing. Apparently you had suspicions as to the use of some sort of fraudulent devices previous to the Volkswagen scandal, but you said that you had no precise example and no specific vehicle in question. But when we look at the 2010 workshop, the one that took place in November, and we look at the minutes from that, what we can see is that it's clearly stated that a vehicle was tested and it showed a very high level of NOx using the low temperature test. Therefore, during that very meeting, at that time, you wondered about if there was a defeat device being used, and you even used that term. So what about that vehicle that you tested? Did you call the manufacturer? Did you call the national authorities in order to really understand exactly how a vehicle could have this type of deviation? What did you do specifically?
Thank you for the question. I think this is the first answer I have given at the meeting. The vehicle that was quoted, that you mentioned, that was quoted yesterday in Guardian article, has been tested indeed by JRC. That was a petrol vehicle. And this vehicle has showed the over-performance in terms of exhaust, in terms of NOx emissions at a specific test, which was type 6 test, so cold start. And at this stage of the work of the engine, this is a natural phenomenon, so there is no surprise as such. Plus, this is one of the cases of exemptions from defeat devices. So we have verified this was not the car that would indeed be the car having a defeat device. I just have to make one more comment concerning your first statement, that we needed a scandal in order to develop the legislation. I would like to make it very clear, we didn't need a scandal to develop legislation. The work on RDE has been going on before. We adopted the RDE package 2 in October, so after the revelations of Volkswagen, and we adopted very quickly type approval framework, but the work on those packages has been ongoing for a long time. So this is not a scandal that made us work on the law. On the very contrary, we started working much before. Thank you.
You're saying that you began work, but just a while ago you said something quite scandalous. You said at the time it wasn't our priority to look at fraudulent software, which is a bit vague. Now, when you look in particular at the 2007 legislation and the period up till now, there are 10 years in which the legislation hasn't been implemented, with direct consequences for public health and consumer protection. For 10 years, you tell me in vain you took your time. What's not working? What's the cause of it not working? Why is legislation adopted in 2007 not implemented now? That's the real question. As the Commission, you are the guarantor of the scrutiny and implementation of legislation. I think I can explain this fairly simply. The use of fraudulent software was prohibited, so there was action. Secondly, there was a risk. We've always indicated a risk that this software may exist, but there were no proven cases of its use. As a result, the efforts mainly focused on the development of more credible testing, to the extent that the use of this type of software wasn't fully proven, and it was regarded as the structural way of solving the problem. Mrs. Köstinger.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you. I'm one of those who are fairly frustrated, but perhaps I'll try and get a better understanding of your working method. Earlier, in answering my colleague's question, you said something about better legal implementation or better shaping of legislation for defeat devices. There was nothing known, and you also said you believed that in Europe a similar standard and similar implementation was underway. But when it comes to stakeholder documents or the International Clean Transport Council, there were clear references to the fact that the US were somewhat ahead of us. How are things working in the Commission? Do you actually read these things? Do you look at these things? Or does that not happen? Do you not feel called upon to make that sort of comparison at all?
As we mentioned earlier on, I think that as far in terms of definition and legislation itself, there's no big difference between the US and the EU. The two main differences that we've seen on this particular case is the fact that manufacturers had to declare their emission control strategy in the US and not in the EU, really, or not to the same extent. The second thing is basically that the market surveillance in the US is more harmonized than in the EU, and from that point of view, what we want to do is the reinforcement of the measures on that with our reform. Do you want to complete on that?
Maybe one additional comment that indeed the US system is very robust, is very complete, but you have to keep in mind that despite of this system being put in place for a long time, it was not EPA that discovered the defeat device. And they still haven't discovered what defeat device we are talking about. That only proves that it's not a simple thing. It takes time. They've been discussing this concept with the manufacturers since 2014, so more than a year now. And the work is still ongoing. So we do take good example, but we also have to understand that there might be shortcomings in any system, no matter how good it might look like.
Gut, dann vielleicht doch noch eine.
Okay, but then I'll ask a second question. As we've seen earlier, there are some parliamentary questions on this topic from this House at particular points of suspicion. What's the Commission's method of dealing with parliamentary questions? We often get very superfluous answers. Are they followed up at all, or is it just a standard answer that goes out when particular suspicious circumstances are mentioned, or are you not aware of this? It may be that you're not aware of this. Well, obviously, Parliament's questions are dealt with scrupulous care, and if there is any clear indication of something, then we follow it up. If we're talking about concerns which are rather vague, we look at them, obviously. It all depends on the question which is asked or the statement that's made when it comes to how we deal with it.
A few very quick questions. First of all, when have you been aware of the fact that in the United States in 1998 there was already a case like this against a manufacturer of trucks? Just about.
Aussitôt que l'événement est survenu.
As soon as the events occurred in the United States, the consequences were the introduction of those devices into the 1998 legislation.
The definition of the software is okay, but the implementation is not, if I understood you correct. My question is, in light of the fact that now Fiat and Opel are being accused to use a very, I would say, generous interpretation, does it not mean that we should have a more precise definition, for instance, when we get into the temperature window?
Yeah, the Commission, and we repeat, the legislation is clear. There might be a need for harmonized interpretation of that, and the Commission is certainly ready to help in that exercise, including via guidance. But for that, we need what I was mentioning earlier on, the detailed information, which is actually not at our disposal at the moment. We need detailed information about what the tests have revealed in order to be able to provide a guidance that is based on the reality. And that's one thing where we basically are ready to do, but we cannot do it in blank. That's the difficulty we've got at that.
Okay. You have meanwhile heard about the situation in Japan, Suzuki and Mitsubishi, and what is coming out there, that there are different ways of manipulating the tests. You do not only need to manipulate the software, you can also manipulate the hardware, for instance, by sending cars which are lighter and so on. Have you come to the conclusion that you should look at additional possible loopholes which you then might have to close?
I think RDE tests, as they've been conceived now by the legislation, are probably the best way to prevent defeat device from being installed, and the legislation that accompanies the defeat device concept. You are aware that we are the only place in the world that will use RDE tests or real-life driving tests in order to eliminate irregularities, potential irregularities, prevent them from happening. Not even the US PEMS tests are used for certification, to be completely clear. They do use laboratory tests among others, but not PEMS tests. So Europe is the only one using this method. And obviously, we are now at the monitoring stage. We will see after the first year how the PEMS equipment operates, what are the first results, and after we'll be monitoring the application of the rules. If there is an event that is brought to our attention that would have to make us think again about improving tests, certainly we'll do it. So this is a constant process. We are not going to stop short of just having RDE in place and then consider that this is all.
Mrs. Werner.
In Ihrer Antwort auf
In your answer to question 10, you say that repeatedly the Commission has called on Member States to allow full access to the results of the national investigations in connection with the higher emissions amongst diesel vehicles. How does France, Germany and the UK explain that refusal, and how has the Commission reacted to that refusal? You previously mentioned at the beginning that without the data you would find it difficult to continue your work.
Yeah, I mean, whether there's a reluctance or not, I mean, there have not been a refusal to transmit us the information for the time being. We've seen we have asked for it by letter from our commissioner. She repeated our request on the 7th of June. We'll see whether that comes. And if it doesn't come, then we'll have to consider every possibility. But this being said, I mean, I underline what I was saying at the beginning of the hearing, which is actually, as long as we do not get that information, we cannot endorse these reports and their conclusions.
Was heißt in diesem Zusammenhang?
What does all possibilities kept open mean? What can you specifically do if the information doesn't arrive?
I won't elaborate on that, but the Commission will have to examine what can be done. We'll probably wish to examine what can be done.
Dann habe ich noch eine zweite.
Then I have a second question. In your written answer to question 5 about on-board diagnostic systems, you refer to the fact that the OBD data is not systematically or centrally collected in Europe. Conversely, in the US, there's an obligation to transmit the data to the authorities. Why do you believe there is this different approach that has been adopted? Does the Commission see no added value in collecting the data, and if they do, what consequences would you learn?
Thank you for the question. It's difficult for me to say what was the reason for having different rules from the rules that are binding in the US. Indeed, this information is collected for the time being by manufacturers, by type approval authorities, so of course there is access to this information on a constant basis. Now the question is, what sort of information would be useful for the Commission, because of course not information can serve the purpose that we would like to achieve, which is having indication of problems with emission systems. So we are actually now considering whether there is a need to improve these rules, and this is an ongoing process.
Thank you, Mr. Schulze.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you. I've listened attentively. A number of questions have been asked, but I think they need to be asked again because I'm not so happy with the answer, or you'll perhaps say you've already answered. I'm no lawyer, I'm an engineer, and I always find it difficult when things are vaguely worded, and that's why I'd like to revisit one topic, the NEDC emissions test on the test bench. It's been explained time and again. This doesn't correspond to reality. In Regulation 715 2007, Article 5, Paragraph 1, it says emission reduction systems in a vehicle are meant to correspond to normal driving conditions, and I would like to hear about these normal operating conditions which aren't defined any better. What do you think real operating conditions mean? It seems to mean real driving, and yet the test is conducted on a test bench. It doesn't seem to correspond to reality.
You're right that the notion of normal conditions is not defined in legislation. What is understood by normal conditions is the totality of the driving possibilities in the real world, and that's why it's very difficult to measure them. That's why we also have to introduce a proxy of conformity factors once we develop the real driving emissions tests and real driving tests. But as I explained also before, the legislation, the Euro 5 legislation, empowers the Commission to adopt the test methods, and at the time, the test method that was developed was the laboratory test. We are changing it now. We are using this empowerment for the second time. This time we have adopted RDE tests, but at the moment we adopted legally binding laboratory tests. This specific empowerment has been used, and there is no contradiction with the matter legislation.
Danke für Ihre Antwort. Befriedigt mich.
I'm not necessarily satisfied with that answer. I'm not really interested in what's being done now, but what happened then. And I think there's a big question mark over this. A second question from me of a technical nature. What's your assessment of the technical skills of the Commission and the officials that are working on this? The automobile industry and others involved certainly have high technical skills. Has the Commission been able to have an impact there?
I think we have all confidence in the technical competence of our colleagues, be they in DG GROW, in DG Klima for WLTP4 CO2 emissions, or in the GRC or elsewhere. There's no doubt about that. This being said, we also draw on expertise from outside, which I explained earlier on, from member states, from academia, from research institutes, from NGOs. So basically, I would say that we're not short of expertise, be it internal or be it external. That is something, and we make sure that we've got all possible information available.
Mr. Karens.
Thank you very much. I've understood from previous answers that there's been no, at least you're not willing to admit to any obstruction by member states or commissioners or politicians or anything like that. So it's taking a long time to get these tests up and going. But I have a question about accountability now moving forward. So in the Soviet Union was known to be an inefficient system. And in bridge building, the engineers make the calculations how to make the bridge to make it stand. Then it's constructed. Everyone is stealing materials. So no one really knows, is the bridge adhering to what it should be built? But they had a clever way to test this. They get lorry drivers with lorries full of sand or rocks or gravel, and they pack the bridge full of the trucks. If the bridge doesn't fall down, it must be safe. I have read in newspaper reports that sometimes in the Nordic countries you have paper mills, and you have directors of the mills drinking the water, the wastewater, showing that it's clean for the environment. So who's going to be breathing the exhaust fumes? How will we understand that we're actually getting to accountability here and that the tests will actually be reflecting what we as legislators are demanding that they reflect?
The tests that are being introduced are actually considered by Commission and 28 member states as suitable and reflecting the real driving emissions. On top of that, there will also be the possibility for stakeholders to proceed with the test and see whether the emissions declared and checked are corresponding to their measures. I mean, that would be the check. This being said, nobody wants to be the lorry driver, the Soviet lorry driver.
Right, but to follow up then, so everyone is saying that these tests are adequate, but what is the way that we can check whether they actually are? Because it's now only theoretical. It's not yet 2017. They're not up and running. What needs to be changed in the system that could show us that they really are? Where's the believability going forward?
The test actually already introduced since the beginning of the year for monitoring purposes, and that actually covers that already, before they become mandatory in 2017. So already before now, the monitoring period has started, and this the results will actually be used first to see whether it functions. Second, there will also be follow-up afterwards because, as you know, from 2017, there is this intention to have a look to review annually the conformity factors to see whether they can be reduced because the uncertainty, the experience with the test and the uncertainty around it will actually, we hope, be reduced. So, I mean, the process for monitoring and improving is already in place.
Et finalement, la dernière.
And lastly, the final speaker for today, Mrs. Bonnefoy.
No, we're finished. Sorry, Claude, but everybody exceeded the time, and we are at the end of the meeting. Yeah, but that doesn't work that way, Claude. If I had time, no problem. If I had time, no problem. But please.
Merci.
I want to put the question.
Hey, come on. Mrs. Bonnefoy.
Okay. Dans l'annexe 1.
In Annex 1, sent by the Commission on the limit conditions, boundary conditions page, you talk about ASIA information. Now, ASIA asked you to increase from 15 to 30 kilometres an hour, didn't they? Although you said you didn't give way to them. Also, cold starts aren't included. High tests have been abandoned, including for sport cars. Tests of 3-minute plus stop, that hasn't been taken account after restarting, and also urban motorway and rural area driving. I would like to hear what points were included at the request of the car industry and on what basis of justification, because you said, as you'd expect, that you've got the necessary experts in the Commission.
Si c'est nécessaire, on peut compléter les...
If necessary, we can supplement Annex 1 information to cover a number of topics on how the Commission decided to include which things and how this all was agreed in the tests of this TCMV. We always wanted a majority agreement in the TCMV. We weren't trying to satisfy industry representatives. If necessary, we can go back over each point of information that you mentioned, and we can supplement those points of information with what the Commission decided and what they decided to include in order to win a majority within the TCMV. Well, I want an answer at least on one of the points. Why have you changed the speed gap? It's a technical example. Why are you taking away this proposal to have high-speed tests? Can you answer those 2 points?
Well, I actually wanted to refer to one of the cases you mentioned, not to the high speed, but to the cold start, because that's one of the elements that you said was missing. And to make you understand also the process, we do plan to include cold start in the third RDE package. This is foreseen. This is part of the new legislation. And the reason why it was not possible to do it on the occasion of the first package was the question of elaboration of method of weighting the values coming out of the cold start with the rest of the journey. So it was a matter of time. It was a matter of doing it within the foreseen deadlines, but doesn't mean we are either giving up into the industry request or that we are forgetting about it. It is being legislated now, and it will be part of the third package. And regarding the remaining elements, we'll provide you the same explanation in writing.
Thank you very much. Mr. Turmes, you have to know that I do the management of the time because people fall from the list. And that's why we can end in time. Just I give you 1 minute to raise a question and an answer.
So, January 2011, RDE group established. GRC proposes PAMS. Why do we lose another 2-3 years by filibustering from car industry, and why do you accept this filibustering? And it is clear from your mail of 2012 that the alternatives proposed by industry are seen by yourselves as cycle beating, which is defeat devices. Why? Again, losing time.
Le détail des travaux qui ont été menés en 2012-2013
The report covers 2012-2030, but the detail of all of the work which was done in 2012-2013 is in the 2013 report. The technical exercises which were carried out is listed there. I can't say whether it was too quick or not. All I can say is that the detail of all of the work that was done.
Yes.
September 2013, you established a task force, and the start of the task force. What's the situation with regard to the task force? It's set up in September 2013. What's happening with the task force? Is it still in existence?
I would like to conclude the meeting of today.
Sorry, this is a
Claude,
yes and no answer.
Claude, we will come up. There are commissioners coming up.
I get
other
impatient. We
representatives
don't get anything from Commission.
No. Well,
this Commission is covering the mismanagement of the
Well,
old
we'll see
Commission.
about that. We'll see about that. First of all, let me. Besides the frustration you can feel amongst our members on several issues, I do want to thank you being here. I would want to thank all the members of the committee today for having a very in-depth discussion on all these issues. We will have to deal with a lot of issues in the future. Please take up to your superiors, your political responsibles within the Commission, the fact that we are not happy with the collaboration on the files and on the documents, and that there needs to be a good preparation for the next meetings to come. But thank you very much for being here.